At dawn on July 10, 1945, Argentine fishermen off the naval base at Mar del Plata saw an unexpected silhouette emerge in the distance. A large U-boat running on the surface suddenly appeared, heading toward the harbour entrance. This would be U-530 of the German Kriegsmarine, arriving unannounced 2 months after World War II had ended in Europe. The vessel's surprise appearance so long after VE Day would spark international headlines, official investigations, and a lasting legend of a final secret mission. This is the story of U-530, the U-boat that escaped to Argentina. U-530 was a Type 9C U-boat, a long-range design meant for extended patrols far from home ports. Measuring about 251 feet in length and displacing over 1,100 tons surfaced, it carried 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 2 aft, and up to 22 torpedoes. Earlier in the war, its class was equipped with a 10.5 centimeter deck gun for surface combat, though many U-boats had these removed later in the war. U-530's conning tower also mounted anti-aircraft guns and carried a Hohentwiel radar transmitter for detecting enemy ships or aircraft. With powerful diesel engines and a new snorkel device, U-530 could travel 13,000 plus nautical miles and even run submerged for extended periods, ideal for stealthy operations across the Atlantic. The submarine's crew normally numbered about 44 to 54 officers and enlisted men. U-530's wartime service had been eventful. Under a previous captain, it conducted 6 combat patrols, sinking 2 Allied merchant ships and damaging another. In January 1945, command passed to Oberleutnant Otto Wermuth, a 24-year-old veteran U-boat officer. It was Wermuth's first command, and he was eager to prove himself. He assumed command of U-530 just as Nazi Germany was teetering on collapse. Wermuth and his crew would soon find themselves on one of the most bizarre voyages in World War II. U-530's fateful final mission began in the last weeks of World War II. On March 3, 1945, Wermuth departed the U-boat base at Horten, Norway, with orders to disrupt Allied shipping in the Western Atlantic. After a covert transit around the British Isles, mostly submerged to avoid overwhelming Allied air patrols, U-530 reached the waters off North America by late April. Initially assigned to hunt convoys near Halifax, Canada, Wermuth found few targets and decided to head south toward the busy sea lanes off New York. There, in the first week of May 1945, U-530 made several fruitless attacks on Allied ships. From May 4th to 7th, the U-boat fired 9 torpedoes at convoys near the New York coast, but all either missed their targets or malfunctioned. These would be the last shots U-530 ever fired in combat. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending the war in Europe. At that moment, U-530 was cruising in the mid-Atlantic, roughly 1,000 miles east of Puerto Rico. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor, had ordered all U-boats to cease hostilities and surrender at the nearest Allied port. For U-boat crews, this directive, transmitted with top priority, meant the war was over. Dozens of submarines surfaced and gave themselves up in May, while others scuttled themselves under the last-ditch Operation Regenbogen plan rather than be captured. Oberleutnant Wermuth, however, made a fateful choice. According to his later testimony, he doubted the surrender message was genuine and feared it might be an Allied trick. Instead of reporting to an Allied port, Wermuth decided to flee. Believing his men might receive better treatment in a far-off country, he set course for neutral Argentina, not realizing that Argentina had quietly declared war on Germany only weeks earlier. Wermuth ordered the crew to cease all offensive operations, and prepared for a long, clandestine voyage. The submarine stayed submerged during daylight hours, using its snorkel to run the diesel engines and recharge batteries while hiding just below the surface. By night, U-530 would cautiously surface to make better speed in the open ocean. Every precaution was taken to avoid drawing attention. The crew even refrained from using their radio except for routine weather reports. They navigated a circuitous route, passing east of Bermuda and crossing the equator in mid-June 1945 under the cover of darkness. In accordance with Dönitz's standing instructions, Wehrmacht also began dumping anything that might be of value to Allied intelligence or pose a hazard during surrender. Overboard went their remaining torpedoes, minus one whose battery had exploded, the broken torpedo warhead and gyroscope, all coded signal books and the ship's logbook, and even the boat's anti-aircraft ammunition and radar equipment. U-530 was shedding weight and secrets as it crept towards South America. By late June 1945, the U-boat had entered the South Atlantic, running low on provisions but still undetected. Initially, Wehrmacht considered surrendering at Miramar near Buenos Aires, but ultimately chose Mar del Plata as the most suitable. On the night of July 9, 1945, U-530 approached the coast of Argentina. After more than 70 days at sea since the German surrender, Wehrmacht's crew prepared to give themselves up at last. The U-boat surfaced off Mar del Plata and cautiously inched toward the harbour, running on the surface under cover of darkness. The long journey was almost over, but the real mystery of U-530 was just beginning. Just before sunrise on July 10, 1945, U-530 made its move. The German submarine's crew hoisted a large white flag and turned on their navigation lights as they neared Mar del Plata's harbour entrance. The sudden appearance of a U-boat took the Argentine defenders by surprise. One account notes the sub slipped past a sentry who had his back turned to the sea. Once inside the port, Wehrmacht blinked the word Aleman Submarino, German submarine, by signal lamp, indicating his intention to surrender peacefully. Argentine naval personnel quickly mustered and surrounded the U-boat. U-530 formally surrendered to the Argentine Navy on the morning of July 10, 1945, ending its odyssey. All 54 crewmen were brought ashore, given hot food and even haircuts, then promptly placed under guard. The U-boat that had roamed the Atlantic was now a prized captive, docked at Argentina's main naval base. The immediate question was, where had U-530 come from, and why now? When interrogated by Argentine officers, Oberleutnant Wehrmacht offered only a sketchy story. He admitted that on VE Day, May 8th, his submarine was operating in the North Atlantic, and that he had decided to sail for Argentina to surrender there. However, Wehrmacht could not satisfactorily explain why the voyage had taken over 2 months, when a direct trip should have been possible in a few weeks. Suspicion grew when the Argentines discovered that U-530 had arrived without its logbook, without any torpedoes or deck gun, and with the crew carrying no personal identification papers at all. Wehrmacht claimed he had scuttled the log and secret materials at sea, as well as the unused munitions, but his vague answers about the U-boat's route and activities did little to ease speculation. To make matters worse, he initially lied that the submarine's engines were malfunctioning, only later confessing that he had deliberately sabotaged the diesel motors before entering port, pouring acid into them, to ensure the U-boat could not be easily reused. Such actions suggested Wehrmacht was hiding something about U-530's final mission. News of the U-boat's mysterious surrender spread quickly, reaching Allied authorities and neighbouring countries. Within days, Argentina, which had only declared war on Germany in March 1945, found itself under intense international scrutiny over U-530. The Argentine Navy moved the crew to an inland detention camp and agreed to hand the submarine over to the United States in the spirit of Allied cooperation. US and Argentine intelligence officers subjected Wehrmacht and his men to extensive interrogation. Repeatedly, the Germans denied carrying any passengers, fugitives, or valuable cargo. Wehrmacht insisted that, at no time during the voyage had the U-530 carried aboard any passengers of any nationality, civilian or military. To skeptics, these denials were expected. If U-530 had secret passengers or cargo, the crew would hardly confess it. The lack of a logbook or clear timeline only fueled suspicions. Despite Wehrmacht's evasiveness about the U-boat's exact route and 2-month delay, no concrete evidence of wrongdoing was immediately found. The Argentine Navy's official communiqué, issued soon after, emphasized that no high-ranking Nazi officials were aboard U-530, no one had been landed on Argentine shores, and the submarine had not been involved in any hostile acts like the recent sinking of the Brazilian cruiser Bahia. In short, Argentina publicly declared U-530's surrender to be routine, but in private, many wondered if there was more to the story. U-530's unexplained voyage set off a storm of rumors and conspiracy theories that linger to this day. In July 1945, the regional press and some Allied officials openly speculated about sensational possibilities. One theory posited that U-530 had made a clandestine detour to spirit away Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun to safety. An Argentine reporter claimed to have seen a police report describing a mysterious U-boat landing on the remote coast of Patagonia, unloading a high-ranking officer and a civilian, supposedly Hitler and his wife disguised in men's clothing. Around the same time, the FBI in the United States received unconfirmed reports that a German submarine had put ashore in southern Argentina or elsewhere in May 1945 with Hitler aboard. These dramatic allegations captured headlines, despite the lack of any hard evidence. U-530 was also accused by a Brazilian admiral of torpedoing the cruiser Bahia on July 4, 1945, since the sub's presence in the South Atlantic roughly coincided with that tragedy. Another Brazilian naval officer speculated that U-530 might even have come all the way from Japan, suggesting some last-gasp Axis collaboration. The fact that U-977, another German U-boat, arrived in Argentina 5 weeks later, surrendering on August 17, 1945, only added fuel to the conspiracy fire. If 2 U-boats showed up in Argentina, some wondered, could they have been on secret missions to deliver Nazi leaders, war loot, or advanced technology to a safe haven? In reality, most of these theories have been debunked or remain unsupported by evidence. A post-war Brazilian inquiry conclusively determined that Bahia was sunk by an accidental onboard explosion during gunnery drills, not by any submarine attack. No credible proof ever emerged linking U-530 to Hitler's escape. Exhaustive Allied investigations concluded with virtually no doubt that Hitler died in his bunker in May 1945. Likewise, while many Nazi officials did flee to Argentina, most arriving by air or through other routes in the years after the war, there is no confirmed record of U-530 transporting anyone or anything. Allied naval intelligence reports from 1945 note that U-530's crew all consistently denied any passengers or special cargo, and the physical inspection of the boat revealed no secret compartments beyond normal storage. U-977's captain, who was interrogated separately, also maintained that his U-boat had no connection to U-530's voyage. While it is understandable why the unexplained delay and missing log fueled imagination, historians generally conclude that U-530's late surrender was an act of rogue obedience and self-preservation, not a Hollywood-style Nazi escape plot. Wehrmacht likely destroyed the log and weaponry to cover up his defiance of orders and to prevent any possible incrimination of his crew. In the end, the legend of U-530 has outlived its reality, a reminder of how mystery can breed speculation. The incident did, however, prompt Allied agencies to keep a close watch on post-war Nazi movements, and it contributed to Argentina's reputation as a haven for fugitive Nazis, albeit mostly via different means. After the surrender, U-530's crew spent several weeks under Argentine custody before being handed over to the United States for further interrogation. In August 1945, the US Navy took possession of U-530 as a war prize, part of a program to study captured German technology. The submarine, along with the later arriving U-977, was towed to the Panama Canal and then up to the east coast of the US. That autumn, U-530 briefly toured a few American port cities, a public exhibit of a defeated U-boat, before the Navy decided it had outlived its usefulness. The men of U-530 were eventually repatriated to Germany in 1947 after 2 years as POWs. Oberleutnant Wermuth himself survived the war and lived into old age, although details of his later life are sparse. In the end, no crew members were charged with wrongdoing beyond failing to follow the original surrender order. The final fate of U-530 came in late 1947, when the US Navy selected the submarine for destruction as a target. On November 20th, 1947, off the coast of Cape Cod, the American submarine USS Toro lined up U-530 in its periscope and fired a live torpedo. The weapon struck U-530 amidships, blowing the U-boat in two and sending it to the bottom of the Atlantic in a fiery plume of water and debris. What had begun as a stealthy commerce raider for the Kriegsmarine ended as scrap metal on the ocean floor off Massachusetts, a quiet conclusion to a voyage shrouded in mystery. U-530's strange journey left a legacy disproportionate to its modest wartime record. In Argentina, the U-boat's arrival in 1945 became part of the folklore of the immediate post-war era, reinforcing suspicions about Nazi activities in South America. The incident did push Argentine authorities to demonstrate cooperation with the Allies, as seen by their swift transfer of the sub and crew to US custody. Internationally, U-530 and the later U-977 served as stark evidence that not every enemy unit surrendered exactly when and where expected. A few stragglers charted their own course in the chaotic final days of World War II. U-530 remains an intriguing case study of Operation Regenbogen's aftermath and the psyche of U-boat crews facing defeat. The mystery of U-530 continues to fascinate, a real-world footnote where fact and legend have often intertwined. While conspiracy theorists have woven elaborate tales around U-530's final mission, the consensus of historical evidence is far more grounded. The U-boat's 2-month disappearance was likely spent hiding from Allied retribution, not smuggling Hitler to a Patagonian hideout. Yet the very lack of a definitive log or full disclosure from Wermuth means U-530's story retains several unanswered questions. In the end, this lone submarine surrender in a distant port encapsulates the tumultuous end of World War II. U-530's voyage to Argentina has secured its place as one of naval history's strangest final missions ever recorded. In March 1944, a handful of shipwrecked sailors clung desperately to debris in the moonlit Atlantic, the wreckage of their ship bobbing in the waves around them. Out of the darkness, a German U-boat surfaced, not to rescue them, but to eliminate them. Gunfire shattered the silence as the submarine's crew opened up with machine guns and tossed hand grenades into the water. It was a shocking breach of the laws of war at sea, a deliberate massacre of survivors known as the Peleus Incident. This act would make U-852 infamous as the only U-boat in World War II whose crew intentionally killed shipwrecked Allied survivors. What led the crew to commit such a heinous act, and how did justice finally catch up with them? Explore the design and mission of U-852, the fateful sinking of the SS Peleus, the harrowing survivor accounts, and the dramatic pursuit, capture, and post-war trial that cemented the Peleus affair as a pivotal case in the history of naval warfare and law. U-852 was a newly built German long-range submarine, a Type 9D2 U-boat commissioned in mid-1943. Significantly larger than the more common Type 7 U-boats, the Type 9D2 was designed for extended operations across distant seas. U-852 stretched nearly 88 meters in length, or 287 feet, and displaced about 1,600 tons on the surface. It carried 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 2 in the stern, and even featured a novel piece of technology, a Bachstel-Zafar 330 rotor kite, a one-man gyrocopter that could be towed aloft to scout for targets over the horizon. This cutting-edge equipment underscored U-852's special role. The man entrusted with U-852 was Kapitän Leutnant Heinz Wilhelm Eck, a 27-year-old career naval officer. Born in Hamburg in 1916, Eck had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1934 and risen through the ranks during the war. By December 1941, he had earned his promotion to Kapitän Leutnant, and in June 1943, he received his first command, the brand new U-852. Though young, Eck was a seasoned sailor who had spent nearly a decade in the German Navy. He took U-852 through its sea trials and training with the 4th U-Boat Flotilla, preparing for the boat's maiden war patrol in early 1944. In January, U-852 departed on its first and only combat patrol, assigned to the 12th U-Boat Flotilla for active service. The mission was top secret and ambitious. The Kriegsmarine was dispatching a handful of long-range U-boats to the Indian Ocean to disrupt Allied shipping far from Europe's well-patrolled waters. U-852 was to join the so-called Monsoon Group operating out of bases in Southeast Asia. To reach those distant hunting grounds, Eck's submarine would have to slip past Allied air patrols and naval forces while rounding the Cape of Good Hope, a journey of thousands of miles. Stealth was critical. Every commander knew that by 1944, Allied anti-submarine coverage extended even into mid-Atlantic. Kapitän Leutnant Eck understood the stakes and had been briefed on Germany's uncompromising U-boat directives. He and other U-boat commanders were under orders not to risk their own vessels to aid enemy survivors. After the 1942 Laconia incident, when a U-boat was attacked by Allied aircraft while rescuing shipwreck survivors, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had issued the notorious Laconia Order. This directive explicitly forbade U-boat crews from attempting any rescue of survivors from torpedoed ships, stating, "Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Be harsh." Eck would later cite this order to justify his actions. But, as events unfolded, he went far beyond merely failing to rescue survivors. He took active measures to exterminate them. U-852's voyage toward the Indian Ocean was uneventful until mid-March 1944. On the night of March 13th, Eck's lookouts sighted a lone merchant vessel. This ship was the SS Peleus, a Greek steam freighter of 4,695 tons, which was operating under charter to the British Ministry of War Transport. Peleus was not in a convoy. She was sailing alone, making her an easy target for a prowling U-boat. Despite his orders to maintain radio silence and avoid unnecessary engagements, Eck decided to attack. Stalking his prey until after nightfall for cover, he maneuvered into firing position. 2 torpedoes sped through the dark sea and struck Peleus, tearing open her hull. Within a short time, the freighter was mortally wounded and began to sink. The Peleus went down, but left behind a broad debris field, shattered timbers, cargo wreckage, and several rafts amid patches of oil. Dozens of sailors from the Peleus had managed to abandon ship in time. The merchant's crew, a mix of nationalities, 18 Greeks, 8 British, and others from Egypt, China, Russia, Chile, and Poland, now found themselves cast into the ocean night. Many were clinging to makeshift rafts or flotsam, frightened but alive. Unbeknownst to them, their ordeal was only beginning. After the torpedo hits, U-8 surfaced near the wreckage. Standard U-boat procedure after a sinking was to question survivors for the ship's name, cargo, and destination, useful intelligence to report back to headquarters. Eck's crew located a drifting survivor and hauled him close enough to inquire about the ship's identity and voyage. Having confirmed it was the Peleus and gathered whatever information they could, the Germans faced a decision. Normally, at this point, a U-boat might depart the scene, leaving survivors to their fate. But Eck was alarmed by the extent of the debris and the presence of survivors. He realized that floating wreckage and rafts could linger for days, a telltale beacon for Allied patrol aircraft, or ships that a U-boat had been in the area. In these waters, Allied planes from West Africa or Ascension Island occasionally scoured for subs. Eck feared that at daybreak, any patrolling aircraft would spot the oil slick and bobbing rafts, potentially bringing swift retaliation. Kapitan Lieutenant Eck made a fateful and gruesome decision to eliminate all traces of the Peleus sinking, including the survivors. He announced his decision to his officers, some of whom were taken aback. Chief Engineer Oberleutnant Hans Lenz immediately protested, telling his captain that he was not in agreement with this order. But Eck was resolute. He curtly replied that he was determined to carry it out, and Lenz's objections were overruled. The mood on the bridge was tense and grim. Eck later admitted he told the crew, with a heavy heart, that he had made the decision to destroy the wreckage. Despite any personal misgivings, the officers prepared to obey their commander. Under Eck's orders, the U-boat's deck machine gun was brought to bear on the floating wreckage and clustered castaways. What followed was an appalling episode of cold-blooded warfare. U-852's officers and select crew opened fire into the darkness, spraying the rafts and debris with automatic weapons. Tracer rounds lit up the night as bullets ripped through wood and flesh alike. Some survivors screamed, others slipped silent beneath the waves. Not satisfied with gunfire alone, Eck instructed his men to also throw hand grenades into the clusters of survivors. The concussions of grenade blasts sent geysers of water and shrapnel across the oil-slicked sea. One by one, the fragile makeshift rafts were punctured and sinking, and the cries of the wounded faded. Below decks, most of the crew remained at their stations, spared from witnessing the full horror. On the conning tower and upper deck, however, several of Eck's officers personally took part. Oberleutnant Lenz, the very man who had objected, found himself in a bizarre moral position. Initially, Lenz had gone below, likely to record the survivors' statements in the log, avoiding participation. But when he returned topside, he saw a young enlisted machinist, Wolfgang Schwender, preparing to fire the machine gun at Eck's command, perhaps to spare the enlisted man, or to ensure the job was done properly. Lenz took the machine gun from Schwender's hands and fired it himself in the general direction of the floating target. The engineer officer who opposed the atrocity ended up directly participating in it, a fact that would weigh heavily in post-war judgments. Also among the shooters was Dr. Walter Weiss-Pfennig, the U-boat's medical officer, who grabbed a firearm and joined in the attack. As a naval doctor, Weiss-Pfennig was a non-combatant by law, forbidden from offensive use of weapons, but in that moment he followed Eck's orders without open hesitation. The boat's second-in-command, Lieutenant August Hoffmann, likewise took part in the machine gunning. Finally, after expending ammunition and explosives, U-852's crew saw no more movement among the debris. Eck was convinced he had erased the evidence of his attack. He ordered a last sweep of the area, then turned his U-boat away from the scene of carnage. In the darkness, U-852 crept off to the south, resuming its voyage toward the Cape. The entire Peleus affair had lasted only a matter of hours, but it would taint the crew for a lifetime. Against all odds, 3 men from the SS Peleus survived the U-boat's deadly purge. In the chaos of bullets and explosions, these men had managed to avoid immediate death, perhaps by hiding among wreckage or playing dead in the water. The survivors were the Greek first officer of the Peleus, 1 Greek seaman and 1 British seaman. Once the submarine left and the night grew quiet, they found themselves alone on the open ocean. The U-boat's crew had smashed or sunk most of the rafts, but a few pieces of flotsam remained, bits of wreckage just enough to keep the men afloat. For 25 excruciating days, these shipwrecked sailors drifted under the burning sun and cold stars of the mid-Atlantic. They were at the mercy of ocean currents and fate. They suffered from extreme thirst, exposure, and hunger. The men likely survived on rainwater, or whatever provisions they could scrape from floating debris. Every day was a struggle not to succumb to dehydration or despair. One can only imagine their hopeless thoughts, having seen comrades mercilessly gunned down. and yet they persevered. Miraculously, after more than 3 weeks adrift, salvation arrived. A Portuguese merchant ship crossing the Atlantic spotted the castaways and hauled them aboard, alive but emaciated. The neutral Portuguese vessel delivered the survivors to safety, likely to a port in West Africa or Brazil, where they could finally recount what had happened on that night. Their testimony was chilling. They described how a German submarine had surfaced, interrogated them, then systematically tried to kill every survivor with machine guns and grenades. The story of the Peleus survivors quickly reached Allied authorities. It was clear that a war crime had occurred at sea, a blatant violation of the laws and customs of warfare. Armed with the survivors' accounts, the Allies were determined to identify and bring to justice the U-boat crew responsible for the Peleus massacre. But first, they had to find the culprit, a difficult task in the vast ocean with only fragmentary clues. All the survivors could say was that a U-boat sank their ship on March 13th, 1944. Although Eck had tried to leave no witnesses, he could not hide his movements from Allied eyes forever. After the Peleus incident, U-852 continued southward. On April 1st, 1944, 2 weeks after the Peleus, Eck intercepted another lone Allied merchant ship, the British steamer Dahomey off the coast of South Africa. He torpedoed and sank this vessel as well, but this time he did not linger or attack survivors. It seems Eck was not eager to repeat the atrocity, now that he was closer to Allied-controlled waters near the Cape. By late April, U-852 had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. The British, alert to U-boat incursions in those waters, maintained aerial patrols from bases in Aden and East Africa. On April 30th, 1944, U-852 was spotted by a Royal Air Force patrol plane, a Vickers Wellington bomber flying out of Aden. The aircraft swooped in, catching the submarine on the surface. Crucially, her pressure hull was compromised, meaning the U-boat could no longer dive. Eck and his crew found themselves in a dire predicament. A crippled submarine, stuck on the surface in hostile waters, with more enemy aircraft surely on the way. Over the next day, the RAF intensified the assault. Eck attempted a desperate gambit. He steered toward the African coastline of present-day Somalia, hoping to beach the U-boat and save his crew. Under repeated bombing runs, U-852 ran aground on a coral reef near Ras Maba on the Somali coast, just north of a village called Bandar Bela. There, pounded by surf and bombs, the U-boat was finished. Eck ordered scuttling charges set, and the crew scuttled and blew up the submarine's wreck on the reef on May 3rd to prevent any intact technology from falling into enemy hands. Out of U-852's crew of 65 men, 7 were killed during the air attacks and beaching. The remaining 58 men scrambled ashore, weary and shaken, but alive. They found themselves in a remote, arid shore of Somaliland. There would be no escape by sea. Allied naval forces would soon arrive, so the Germans attempted to hide or flee inland. Local British officered units, including the Somaliland Camel Corps and indigenous militia, swiftly converged on the landing site. Within a short time, Eck and his surviving crew were captured on the beaches or nearby. When British forces searched the wreck of U-852, they made several notable discoveries. Amid the twisted hull, they found the collapsed FAR 330 Backstelze, providing the Allies their first concrete look at this novel German recon device. More importantly, a Royal Navy boarding party recovered Captain Lieutenant Eck's war diary and other documents from the U-boat. That log, alongside the statements of survivors and crew, would soon become damning evidence. With U-852's crew in custody as prisoners of war, the British authorities began a thorough investigation into the Peleus incident. Interrogations soon corroborated what the Peleus survivors had described. In fact, engineer Hans Lenz gave a full written confession while in prison, detailing the order and how it was carried out. Combined with the 2 surviving Greeks' eyewitness testimonies and the U-boat's recovered log entries, which likely noted the encounter with Peleus, the Allies amassed an airtight case. They prepared to put the perpetrators on trial for violating the laws of war by killing unarmed survivors at sea. In October 1945, barely 5 months after Germany's surrender, a British military court in Hamburg convened to hear the case of United Kingdom vs. Heinz Wilhelm Eck, soon dubbed the Peleus trial. The accused were Heinz Wilhelm Eck, Lieutenant zur See August Hoffmann, Dr. Walter Weispfennig, engineer Hans Lenz, Wolfgang Schwender, an enlisted machinist. They were jointly charged with committing a war crime in that they, in the Atlantic Ocean on the night of the 13th and 14th of March 1944, as captain and members of the crew of U-852, which had sunk the steamship Peleus, were concerned in the killing of members of the crew of the said steamship, Allied nationals, by firing and throwing grenades at them. In plain terms, they were accused of murdering shipwreck survivors, a clear breach of the laws and usages of war. The trial lasted only 4 days, 17th to the 20th of October 1945, indicating how straightforward the evidence was. The prosecution opened by laying out the facts: the sinking of Peleus, the surfacing of U-852, and the deliberate machine gunning and grenading of the survivors, which resulted in all but 3 of the 35 crew of Peleus being killed. Those 3 survivors drifted for over 25 days before rescue. The courtroom heard harrowing witness accounts confirming that Eck's crew had indeed opened fire on defenseless men in the water. In their defense, Heinz Wilhelm Eck and his men did not deny that the shootings took place. The facts were incontrovertible. Even Eck took the stand and admitted all the acts alleged in the charge. Instead, the defense's strategy hinged on justification and obedience. Eck claimed that what he did was operationally necessary, an unfortunate necessity of war to prevent detection of his U-boat. He referenced the Laconia incident, recounting how a U-boat, commanded by Hartenstein, that had rescued survivors, was betrayed by a plane that attacked it despite a Red Cross flag. Eck argued that after hearing of that incident, he was convinced that military reasons came before human reasons in this war, and thus he felt justified in taking ruthless measures. The other defendants, Hoffmann, Weispfennig, Lenz, and Schwender, mainly leaned on the classic defense of superior orders. They contended that they were following their commander's directives, which they as military personnel were bound to do. In essence, the junior men argued, "We had no choice. Our captain ordered it, and in wartime, a subordinate cannot safely refuse an order." One notable courtroom moment came with the testimony of Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, a highly decorated U-boat commander, whom the defense called as an expert witness. Schnee had been on Admiral Dönitz's staff and was intended to bolster Eck's argument that commanders might feel compelled to eliminate evidence under certain circumstances. However, under cross-examination, the British prosecutor put Schnee in a bind: either justify Eck's actions or admit they were beyond the pale. Ultimately, Schnee conceded that he would not have done what Eck did. After hearing both sides, the judges were unequivocal. In his summing up, the judge advocate told the court they should not be distracted by arguments of military necessity or complex points of international law. The act of firing on helpless shipwreck survivors was fundamentally against the usage of war and could not be excused. On October 20th, 1945, the British military court found all 5 defendants guilty of the war crime as charged. In weighing the degrees of culpability, the tribunal considered each man's role and any mitigating factors. However, the gravity of the crime, the cold-blooded killing of unarmed survivors, called for stern punishment. Heinz Wilhelm Eck, as captain and the one who gave the order, bore the greatest responsibility. August Hoffmann, his second in command, had also enthusiastically carried out and enabled the order, and Dr. Walter Weispfennig, though a junior officer, had violated his protected status as a medical officer by willingly participating in the killing. The court regarded these three as most blameworthy. Accordingly, the court pronounced that Eck, Hoffmann, and Weiss-Pfennig were to suffer death, all three sentenced to execution by firing squad. Lenz was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Schwender to 15 years imprisonment. On the morning of November 30th, 1945, in a secluded area near Hamburg, Kapitänleutnant Eck, Dr. Weiss-Pfennig, and Lieutenant Hoffmann were executed by a British naval firing squad. Heinz Wilhelm Eck, at age 29, became the only German U-boat commander executed for war crimes in World War II. His two officers met the same fate together with him, ending the lives of the trio who had led and carried out the Peleus atrocity. Meanwhile, Lenz and Schwender were shipped off to serve their prison terms. They were not imprisoned for long. The geopolitical tides shifted in the post-war years, and many war criminals had their sentences commuted. Lenz was released in 1952, and Schwender was released in 1951 after about 6 years. The U-852 Peleus incident holds a distinct place in World War II history as a stark example of the limits of military necessity in wartime. It was the only case in which Kriegsmarine U-boat personnel were convicted of war crimes during the Second World War. Thousands of combatants from the Nazi Wehrmacht were prosecuted for atrocities on land, but the men of U-852 were unique among their naval peers. The case set a clear precedent that even in the ferocity of naval warfare, there are lines that must not be crossed. The long-standing customs of the sea demanded that helpless survivors be treated humanely. While submarines were not expected to rescue enemies, especially after incidents like Laconia, actively hunting down survivors was deemed inexcusable. The British Tribunal's rejection of Eck's operational necessity defence was a strong statement that adhering to the laws of war outweighs any presumed tactical advantage gained by such brutality. In the annals of World War II, Kapitänleutnant Heinz Wilhelm Eck's name is not remembered for bold naval victories. His U-boat sank only 2 ships, but for the atrocious crime that followed one of those sinkings. The war crimes of U-852 remind us that even in total war, humanity must prevail. The oceans, often merciless by nature, have long had a code of mercy among sailors. By shattering that code, Eck sealed his own fate. His execution, a rare instance of paying the ultimate price for a battlefield atrocity, reinforced the enduring law of war. To be shipwrecked is to be out of the fight, and to deliberately kill survivors is murder, not war. The first light of dawn crept over a calm Atlantic on August 24, 1943. German U-boat U-185 cruised on the surface northwest of the Azores, her diesel engines thumping steadily as lookouts scanned the sky. After weeks at sea, the crew was exhausted and on edge, yet nothing seemed amiss on this calm summer morning. Suddenly, streaks of tracer fire and the thunder of explosions engulfed U-185. Mortally wounded, the once feared U-boat slid beneath the waves within minutes, leaving her crew fighting desperately for survival. Explore the design, service, and the dramatic final patrol. U-185 was a long-range Type 9C U-boat, a formidable predator built to stalk Allied shipping relentlessly. Laid down at the A.G. Weser shipyard in Bremen in mid-1941 and commissioned in June 1942, she measured 252 feet, displacing about 1,125 tons at full load. Her twin diesel engines churned out 4,400 shaft horsepower, giving her a top speed of 18 knots on the surface and about 7 knots submerged. Designed for endurance, U-185 could roam far, over 13,000 nautical miles on a single fueling, allowing her to prowl distant waters. The U-boat's armament made her a serious threat to any ship she encountered. 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 2 astern, lay ready with a total of 22 torpedoes, each a deadly 21-inch torpedo capable of breaking a merchant ship's back with one hit. On deck, U-185 sported a 4.1-inch deck gun, useful for finishing off crippled ships or engaging smaller vessels on the surface. As Allied air patrols grew more dangerous, she was also fitted with anti-aircraft weapons, including one 1.5-inch anti-air gun and one twin 20mm flat gun on an elevated Wintergarten platform aft of the conning tower. With a crew of about 50 officers and men tightly packed in her steel hull, U-185 was a self-contained war machine, albeit one that offered its crew only cramped quarters and constant peril. Yet in 1942, morale was high. U-185 and her sisters represented Germany's best hope to choke off Allied supply lines across the ocean. Under the command of Kapitänleutnant August Maus, U-185 embarked on her maiden war patrol in the fall of 1942. Slipping out of Kiel on October 27, 1942, she ventured into the Atlantic on a 67-day sortie. The patrol took her far from home waters, down to the vicinity of the Azores. In early December, U-185 scored her first kill, the lone British freighter Peter Maersk. A fanfare of torpedoes and a burst of the deck gun sent the 5,500-ton cargo ship to the bottom, marking a grim Christmas for its crew and a victorious New Year's arrival for U-185. By January 1, 1943, the U-boat crept into the occupied French base at Lorient, her grey hull scarred by Atlantic storms, but her confidence bolstered by success. For her second patrol, U-185 pushed even further afield. Departing Lorient in February 1943, Maus took his boat across the Atlantic to the warm waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, regions that had become hunting grounds for Germany's U-boat fleet. In March, while prowling the Windward Passage in the Caribbean, U-185 intercepted a small convoy at night and torpedoed 2 Allied tankers. Both ships erupted in flames and sank, adding over 13,000 tons of shipping to her tally. Weeks later, in April, the U-boat ambushed another convoy near Cuba, sending a large Liberty ship to the bottom as well. By early May 1943, after 85 days at sea, she slipped back into port in Bordeaux, France. The crew was weary, but proud. Their U-boat had become an accomplished predator with several victories to its name. As U-185 prepared for her third war patrol in June 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a dire phase for the U-boats. The prior month saw the U-boat fleet suffer its worst losses of the war, known commonly as Black May. Departing Bordeaux and through the Bay of Biscay, U-185 soon tasted these worsening fortunes. On June 14th, a British Whitley bomber surprised her on the surface. In the chaos of bomb blasts and strafing, a nearby U-boat, U-564, was fatally struck and lost. U-185, however, fought back ferociously. Her gunners peppered the attacker with flak, damaging the aircraft so badly that it crash-landed into the sea. The U-boat escaped with only minor wounds, its crew shaken but emboldened. Continuing onward, Maus took U-185 into the South Atlantic in mid-1943, patrolling the waters off the coast of Brazil, where Allied shipping lanes offered rich targets. On July 7th, 1943, U-185 encountered convoy BT-18 off Brazil and pounced with lethal effect. In a single day, the Wolf struck down 3 large Allied cargo vessels, including 2 Liberty ships and a tanker, and left a 4th badly damaged. The tropical waters churned with debris and oil as U-185 scored one of the Kriegsmarine's most devastating strikes in the region. The offensive continued. Days later, they torpedoed a Brazilian steamer and even surfaced to finish off a straggling British freighter with their deck gun, a bold move in waters increasingly prowled by Allied patrol planes. By early August 1943, U-185 had become a successful hunter, credited with sinking 9 ships totaling over 60,000 tons. But each triumph brought heightened risk. On July 12th, a US Navy bomber attacked U-185 near Recife. The submarine survived with only minor damage. A few weeks later, on August 3rd, a Ventura bomber caught U-185 on the surface and dropped depth charges, wounding 1 crewman but failing to destroy the boat. These close calls were continued signs that the Allies were closing in further on their undersea foe. Still, Mouse set his course back toward Europe, unaware of the peril that was about to unfold. U-185's third patrol would also be her last. In early August 1943, as U-185 prowled off the coast of Brazil, the boat received urgent orders. Another German submarine, U-604, was in dire straits not far away. U-604, under Captain Lieutenant Horst Höltring, had been badly mauled by American aircraft and a relentless US destroyer, and now lay crippled and unable to continue. On the morning of August 11th, U-185 cautiously approached the crippled U-604, bobbing in the swells. One by one, oil-soaked and exhausted men leapt into the Atlantic and were hauled aboard U-185. The transfer was frantic. Spare parts, food, and fuel were passed between submarines as well. By afternoon, a second U-boat, U-172, also arrived to assist. But 3 submarines lingering together on the surface made a tempting target. Allied radio direction finders had sniffed out their meeting point, and soon the buzz of incoming aircraft sent the U-boats scrambling. A US Navy B-24 Liberator appeared overhead and immediately dove to attack. U-172 crash-dived to safety, and U-604 lay helpless and half-abandoned. U-185's anti-aircraft gunners, however, stood their ground and opened fire with everything they had. As the Liberator lined up for a third bombing run, U-185's flak riddled the plane. In a moment of grim victory, the big bomber went down in flames, crashing into the sea and killing its crew. It was a rare achievement for a U-boat, shooting down a 4-engine patrol bomber, and it saved U-185 from destruction that day. In the aftermath, U-604 was scuttled by her crew to prevent capture, slipping beneath the waves. Captain Mouse now faced an arduous journey. U-185 was massively overcrowded, with close to 100 souls crammed into a submarine built for just 50. The air was foul, provisions were stretched thin, and tensions ran high in confines of the U-boat. Still, Mouse resolved to get his men home. For 5 days, U-185 ploughed northward through the mid-Atlantic. On August 16th, a rendezvous with U-172 finally brought some relief. In a brief transfer on the open sea, Mouse offloaded 23 of the rescued men to U-172, which then headed back toward base. Those transferred would prove to be the fortunate ones. As August wore on, U-185 was instructed to meet yet another U-boat, U-847, which would refuel her for the final leg home. Mouse altered course toward the rendezvous point in the mid-Atlantic, northwest of the Azores. But a cruel twist of fate intervened. U-847 was delayed, leaving U-185 to wait, exposed on the surface, for an extra 2 days. On the early morning of August 24th, 1943, U-185 was making her way to the new meeting point in broad daylight. The weather was fair, the seas gentle, but the same clear skies that aided navigation also made the lonely U-boat a perfect target for roaming Allied aircraft. Without realizing it, U-185 had been detected by a hunter-killer task force that was scouring the area for U-boats. The escort carrier USS Core, patrolling ahead of a convoy, had dispatched a pair of aircraft to investigate a radio contact. Lieutenant Williams and his wingman, Lieutenant Martin O'Neill, were flying an Avenger bomber and a Wildcat fighter, respectively, scanning the waves from on high. They nearly missed the U-boat amid the patchy clouds, until a glint of sunlight reflected off the wet hull, giving away their position. O'Neill's Wildcat struck first, screaming out of the bright eastern sky in a hail of gunfire. The German lookouts had little chance. Caught off guard by the blinding sun, several were cut down instantly. The twin 20mm flak guns barked a few shots in reply, but were quickly silenced as their crew fell. In the conning tower, Captain Mouse was grazed by flying splinters as bullets tore through the bridge. Chaos reigned below as alarm bells rang out. Before the crew could fully react, Williams's Avenger dived in next. With nerves of steel, he released 2 Mark 47 depth bombs that splashed into the water just yards off U-185's beam. The blasts were devastating. One explosion erupted beneath the U-boat's conning tower, the other just behind it, buckling the pressure hull. U-185 lurched violently, her deck gun blown off its mount and her hull ripped open to the sea. Inside the U-boat, the situation turned horrifying in seconds. The force of the explosions ruptured ballast tanks and tore open internal seams, allowing seawater to flood in and mix with battery acid. Clouds of chlorine gas hissed through the compartments, burning the lungs of anyone who inhaled. Electrical systems shorted out in showers of sparks, plunging the interior into darkness, save for dim emergency lights. One of the diesel engines caught fire, filling the aft compartments with thick smoke. Crewmen were thrown from their posts. Some lay injured or unconscious as toxic gas spread. Mouse, dazed and wounded, realized U-185 was mortally hit. With power knocked out and deadly fumes spreading, staying below meant certain death. He struggled up the ladder and gave the order for all hands abandon ship. Throughout the boat, sailors heard the cry and passed it along. What followed was a desperate scramble for survival. Dozens of men clawed their way up ladders toward the conning tower and outer hatches as the submarine began to slide under. Amid the mayhem, acts of bravery and tragedy unfolded. Kapitan Lieutenant Höltring of U-604, himself wounded, found a gravely injured crewman begging for a merciful death rather than drowning. Höltring grimly obliged with his pistol, then turned it on himself in those final moments. Up on deck, sailors poured out of hatches into the open air, only to be met with smoke and the tilting, slick surface of the sinking U-boat. Many leapt overboard at once, fearing an imminent explosion. Others paused to grab life jackets or help comrades. Captain Mouse stayed until the last possible moment, urging his men to go before he finally hurled himself into the ocean. As U-185's bow reared up, he leaped clear. The U-boat rose nearly vertical, steel groaning as it slipped under. In those final minutes, the U-boat became a steel tomb for dozens of men trapped inside or tangled in the wreckage, including most of the unfortunate U-604 survivors who had escaped one doom only to meet another. In the aftermath of U-185's destruction, German sailors bobbed in the open ocean, clinging to debris or huddling in half-inflated rafts. The USS Barker, an American destroyer, arrived later that day to pluck many of the men from the water. Many had been adrift for hours, coated in oil and suffering from burns, shrapnel wounds, or lungfuls of chlorine gas. Out of an estimated 75 to 80 men who had been on board, only 36 were rescued alive. Kapitan Lieutenant August Mouse among them. In addition to 25 of U-185's own crew, only a handful of the U-604 men survived the ordeal, fewer than 10. The rest had drowned or succumbed to their injuries. For the survivors, the war was over. They were taken as prisoners and spent the remainder of World War II in American POW camps. August Mouse received Germany's prestigious Knight's Cross in September 1943 for his successful patrols. Most would not see Germany again until 1946, long after the guns had fallen silent. The sinking of U-185 was one more hard-won victory in the Atlantic campaign. Lieutenant Williams, the Avenger pilot, earned a second Navy Cross for his actions that day. The success of USS Corps' hunter-killer group in late August 1943 underscored the shifting tide of the war at sea. Increasingly, U-boats that once prowled with impunity were being hunted down from the air, their chances of survival dwindling with each encounter. U-185 had enjoyed a string of victories, but in the end, like so many other U-boats, Allied technology, tactics, and sheer numbers turned the tides against the U-boat menace. In the early hours of January 12, 1942, radio stations across the North Atlantic caught a chilling SOS. The British freighter Cyclops, laden with passengers and cargo, had been ambushed off Nova Scotia. 2 torpedoes from the German U-boat U-123 tore into the 9,000-ton ship. Canadian rescue vessels rushed to the scene and saved 93 people, but Cyclops was doomed. This surprise attack marked the opening of a deadly new front in the Second World War. German U-boats had brought the Battle of the Atlantic to America's doorstep. Over the following 6 months, U-boats prowled United States coastal waters with impunity, sinking more than 600 Allied ships in what would become known as the Second Happy Time or Operation Drumbeat. The carnage would eclipse anything seen before in the U-boat war, catching the United States woefully unprepared. Days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of Germany's U-boat fleet, saw an opportunity to cripple Allied shipping in the Western Atlantic, the so-called tonnage war strategy. With Hitler's approval, Dönitz hastily drew up Operation Paukenschlag, or Drumbeat, a bold plan to strike American coastal shipping with U-boats as suddenly as a kettle drum's beat. However, resources were limited. The German Navy had many U-boats, but most were the shorter-range Type 7 boats unsuited for long-range patrols off North America. Only a handful of larger Type 9 U-boats were available that could make the 3,000-mile journey across the Atlantic and still have fuel to patrol and return. In late 1941, Dönitz could initially spare just 5 Type 9 boats for the mission. One more had been intended, but was sidelined by mechanical trouble. Despite the small force, Dönitz was determined to make a maximum impact. The 5 U-boat commanders, Reinhard Hardigan, U-123, Ernst Kals, U-130, Robert Richard Zapp, U-66, Heinrich Bleichrodt, U-109, and Ulrich Volkers, U-125, were handpicked for skill and daring. They received sealed orders only to be opened at sea, detailing their specific patrol areas along the North American coast. Each submarine was packed with as much fuel, torpedoes, and supplies as possible for an extended mission. On December 18, 1941, the first U-boat slipped out of the concrete pens at Lorient. The secrecy was such that Hardigan was provided only tourist guidebooks for New York City, one containing a fold-out harbor map instead of proper naval charts. Allied intelligence quickly noticed increased U-boat radio traffic and movement. British code breakers and the WWII service tracking stations plotted the U-boat's course across the Atlantic. By analyzing fragmentary signals, Royal Navy analyst Roger Wynne deduced the U-boats were headed for America's east coast and warned US Navy chiefs of a heavy concentration of U-boats off the North American seaboard. This warning, sent in late December 1941, was relayed to US commanders, but little was done in response. Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, in charge of the eastern sea frontier, the US Atlantic coast from Maine to North Carolina, was explicitly cautioned on January 12th that several U-boats were about to strike coastal shipping. Yet, he rejected calls to institute convoys for protection, arguing that grouping ships would only make easier targets. This stance typified the American approach at the outset: no coastal convoys, no mandatory blackouts, and a general underestimation of the U-boat threat. The United States in early 1942 was not ready for modern submarine warfare. The US Navy had almost no small escort vessels comparable to the British corvettes and frigates used for anti-submarine patrols. Few long-range patrol aircraft were available to cover coastal waters. Although dozens of US destroyers existed, they were initially held in port, or assigned to offensive patrols, rather than convoy escort duty. Admiral Ernest J. King, the US Navy's commander-in-chief, was slow to redirect resources to the Atlantic defense, partly due to competing priorities in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, and partly due to a belief that aggressive hunting, not defensive convoys, was the best use of his ships. Even basic civil defense measures were lacking. Coastal cities persisted with normal lighting at night, despite British advice to enforce blackouts. In fact, as late as mid-December 1941, American coastal towns were only asked, not ordered, to consider turning off their lights, and many refused out of concern for hurting tourism. So when the German U-boats approached in January 1942, they found a coastline literally shining like a beacon for their targets. Under these favorable conditions, the first wave of U-boats struck hard in January 1942. Dönitz's plan was for the 5 Type 9 boats to arrive off the east coast and begin attacks simultaneously around mid-January. In reality, Reinhard Hardigan in U-123 had already kicked off the offensive with the sinking of SS Cyclops on January 12th. Now, as the other U-boats reached their patrol areas, merchant ships and tankers along the US coast started going down in alarming numbers. Hardigan, assigned to the waters off New York and New Jersey, made a daring approach right into America's backyard. On the night of January 14th, U-123 torpedoed the tanker Nornes within sight of Long Island, New York. Astonishingly, no US Navy ships responded to the attack. The very next night, he sank the British tanker Coimbra near Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Steaming south, Hardigan found an abundance of easy targets. At one point, U-123 was so close to shore that it nearly scraped the seabed, yet coastal vessels continued to sail by fully illuminated, unaware of the lurking danger. Hardigan was amazed at the situation. In his log, he noted that the American coast was completely lit up, with cities and boardwalks glowing against the night sky. Merchant ships sailed as if it were peacetime. Some lit up like floating Christmas trees. In his words, targets were so plentiful that Hardigan quipped it was a pity only a few U-boats were on hand. 10 or 20 submarines would have found targets in plenty, he wrote, remarking on the unbelievable sight of the brightly lit shoreline. In a span of days, U-123 and the other U-boats began a killing spree along the east coast. On January 19th, for example, U-66 under Commander Zapp lay off the coast of New Jersey. The lights of Atlantic City illuminated the silhouette of the unescorted Canadian passenger liner SS Lady Hawkins, making her an easy target. U-66 sank the liner with 2 torpedoes. Of the 320 people aboard, only 71 survivors were ultimately rescued. It was one of many tragic losses against the glow of American cities. By the end of January 1942, the 5 German U-boats had cut a swath of destruction from Nova Scotia to the Carolinas. In their first weeks off North America, these 5 U-boats sank at least 25 ships in total. Hardigan alone claimed 7 ships on that initial patrol, totaling roughly 46,700 tons. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Kals sank 6 ships, approximately 36,900 tons, and Robert Zapp destroyed 5 ships, approximately 33,500 tons. Meanwhile, Heinrich Bleichrodt torpedoed 4 vessels, approximately 27,600 tons. Only one boat had relatively modest results. U-125, under the rookie commander Ulrich Folkers, sank just 1 ship, approximately 6,700 tons, on this mission. Folkers' meager showing earned him a rebuke from Dönitz, although he would later prove his ability in subsequent patrols. When the first wave finally slipped back to their French base in late January and early February, Dönitz was elated. He noted that each U-boat captain had such an abundance of opportunities for attack that he could not by any means utilize them all. While German submarines ravaged US coastal shipping, the American response in these early weeks remained frustratingly ineffective. The Royal Canadian Navy, by contrast, reacted swiftly in its own waters. As soon as drumbeat began, Canada organized coastal convoys to protect shipping near Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. This quick action paid dividends. 37 ships were lost in Canadian-controlled waters in January to February, but only 11 in March to April, as the new convoys dramatically reduced U-boat successes up north. The German U-boats, finding Canadian waters increasingly defended, shifted their focus southward to the poorly protected US coast. There, Admiral King and the US Navy still hesitated to implement full convoys. A few US destroyers were finally released from New York Harbor in late January, but they were deployed on sporadic offensive patrols rather than systematically escorting merchants. With coastal defense disorganized, some American ships continued to sail alone on predictable routes, and navigational aids like lighthouses remained lit. It was, as one historian later observed, a catastrophe waiting to happen, and it only grew worse as more U-boats arrived. Emboldened by the first wave's success, Dönitz quickly sent reinforcements. In February 1942, a second wave of long-range Type 9 U-boats reached American waters to continue the offensive. At the same time, Germany launched Operation Neuland, a coordinated U-boat thrust into the Caribbean Sea to strike the vital oil refineries and tanker routes of Aruba, Curaçao, and the wider West Indies. By late winter and early spring, the U-boat campaign extended far beyond the original East Coast targets. With all available Type 9 boats in action, Dönitz even took the extraordinary step of deploying the shorter-range Type 7 U-boats to US waters. These smaller submarines normally lacked the range for transatlantic patrols, but they were modified and crammed with extra fuel and provisions, even filling water tanks with diesel to make the journey. They crossed the ocean at low speed to conserve fuel, rendezvoused with resupply U-tankers at sea, and then slipped into the attack zones off North America. By the spring of 1942, the number of U-boats operating around the Americas had swelled dramatically. At one point, approximately 19 to 21 U-boats were on station simultaneously. The geographic scope of Operation Drumbeat now ranged from the Canadian Maritimes down to the tropics. German subs struck ships off the US East Coast, in the Caribbean, and even in the Gulf of Mexico. Tankers and freighters were torpedoed within sight of Trinidad's oil installations, and by May 1942, U-boats roamed as far west as the entrance of the Gulf. Florida's coastline, with its busy ports and tourist cities, became a new killing ground. In total, 24 ships were sunk off Florida's coast during the first half of 1942. One particularly brazen attack occurred on April 11, 1942, when Hardigan's U-123 surfaced just off Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Under cover of darkness, the U-boat fired on the fully laden American tanker SS Gulf America only a few miles from shore. The tanker exploded in flames, an inferno so large that residents in Jacksonville and along Florida's coast could see the fire and heard the thunderous explosion from land. The Gulf America went down with 19 crewmen, though 29 others managed to escape. Such attacks brought the war uncomfortably close to American civilians, underscoring how deeply the U-boats had penetrated US waters. All through the spring of 1942, Allied shipping losses continued to mount at an alarming rate. Month after month, dozens of ships were being sent to the bottom by U-boats operating with virtual freedom. In fact, during the first half of 1942, German U-boats sank more Allied ships in the Atlantic than they had in any previous year of the war. The carnage in March, April, May, and June 1942 was especially high, as new U-boat waves kept arriving, and the US had yet to implement a comprehensive defense. The toll included tankers carrying oil, freighters with war supplies, and the lives of countless sailors and merchant mariners. Some U-boat commanders even grew bold enough to shell coastal targets with deck guns or to attack in daylight, confident that American anti-submarine forces were spread too thin to stop them. By late spring 1942, the United States Navy could no longer ignore the devastation. Under pressure from Allied advisors and confronted with skyrocketing losses, the US finally began to strengthen its coastal defenses. One of the first measures was to implement blackouts in coastal cities and enforce dimming of navigational lights. By April 1942, lights along the eastern seaboard, from seaside resorts to major ports, were gradually turned off or shaded. This belated action meant U-boats could no longer so easily spot targets against the glow of city skylines. The American coastline finally went dark around April, as noted by observers. More critically, the US Navy started to introduce coastal convoys in the spring and early summer of 1942. In mid-April, the Navy established a partial system whereby ships would move in small escorted groups by day, then anchor in protected harbors at night. These short coastal hops were of limited effectiveness. U-boats still found opportunities to strike in gaps between patrols. However, it was a start. By May, Canada had extended its convoy routes southward, escorting tankers from the Caribbean all the way up to Halifax. The Royal Navy also sent a few escort groups, such as small warships and armed trawlers, to help patrol American waters and the Caribbean. Allied air patrols, including US Army Air Force planes and British aircraft, increased along the coast. These measures gradually began to pay off. By the summer of 1942, U-boat sinkings of ships in US coastal waters had begun to slow down as convoy escort coverage improved and the element of surprise was lost. Finally, in August 1942, the US Navy implemented a fully integrated coast-wide convoy system, effectively ending the unchecked U-boat massacre in American home waters. From that point on, it became far more dangerous for German subs to operate near US shores, and they shifted their tactics or moved to other hunting grounds. The second happy time, as the U-boat men had dubbed this period of easy kills, was drawing to a close. It's important to note that even as the US got a handle on coastal defense, the U-boats did not escape unscathed forever. Increased patrols and convoy escorts led to more U-boat sinkings, especially in mid-1942 and afterward. By the end of the Drumbeat campaign, several German submarines had been destroyed by Allied aircraft and warships in the Atlantic littoral. For example, U-85, U-352, and U-157 were among U-boats sunk off the US East and Gulf coasts in 1942. However, during the Operation Drumbeat phase, German losses were relatively small compared to the enormous damage they inflicted. Operation Drumbeat effectively lasted from January through August of 1942. In those 8 months, German U-boats exacted a horrific toll on Allied shipping in the Western Atlantic. All told, an estimated 609 Allied ships were sunk, representing over an estimated 3.1 million tons of merchant shipping sent to the bottom. Nearly 5,000 lives were lost, the majority of them Allied merchant mariners who died supplying the war effort. By comparison, the German U-boat force lost only 22 U-boats in the same period. This lopsided exchange underscores how devastating Drumbeat was for the Allies. In fact, one analysis notes that the U-boats sank more ships in the first half of 1942 alone than in any full year of World War II up to that point. Historians and naval officials later assessed Operation Drumbeat as one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the US Navy in terms of shipping loss on its own doorstep. It has been described as America's greatest naval defeat, a disaster that, in hindsight, might have been mitigated or even avoided with swifter action. Only after suffering enormous losses did the US Navy change course and adopt the convoy system that Britain and Canada had already proven effective. For the Germans, Operation Drumbeat was the high watermark of their war on shipping. They referred to this period gleefully as the second happy time, recalling the easy victories of the early war days against unprotected British shipping. U-boat captains like Reinhard Hardigan became celebrated figures in Germany, lauded for bringing the war to American waters. Hardigan himself survived the war and later reflected on how astonished he was at the lack of US preparedness in 1942. In the United States, however, the Drumbeat disaster was shrouded in wartime secrecy. At the time, the Navy did not publicize the extent of the shipping losses for fear of causing panic on the home front. Many Americans remained unaware that enemy submarines had been sinking hundreds of ships just off their shores. It was only later, after the war, that the full story of Operation Drumbeat came to light, and the lessons were fully learned. The U-boat assault on America's coast in 1942 stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of complacency and the importance of naval preparedness. What began with the SOS of the Cyclops ended as a sobering chapter in naval history, one that proved costly for the Allies, and which forced the US Navy to rapidly improve its anti-submarine warfare tactics in defense of its coasts. Through heavy sacrifice, the Allies did eventually turn the tide against the U-boats. By mid-1943, improved convoys, new technology, long-range patrol aircraft, and the cracking of German codes all contributed to dramatically higher U-boat losses, culminating in Black May 1943, when several dozen U-boats were sunk in a few weeks. But the legacy of Operation Drumbeat endured. It demonstrated both the lethal effectiveness of unrestricted submarine warfare and the dire consequences of unpreparedness. In all, Operation Drumbeat was a brutal campaign of attrition at sea, a drumbeat of destruction along America's shores, whose echoes would drive Allied resolve to never again allow such a vulnerability at home. In the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance. German U-boats prowled the North Atlantic shipping lanes in wolf packs, threatening Britain's vital supply convoys. March 1943 marked the lowest point for the Allies. In that single month, U-boats sank roughly 567,000 tons of Allied shipping. An Admiralty report soberly concluded that the Germans had never come so close to severing the Atlantic lifeline as they did in those first 20 days of March 1943. By April, the Allies were seriously concerned that the U-boat offensive might succeed in strangling Britain. As one Royal Navy officer recalled, "There's nothing more sorrowful or harrowing than to see a ship and to hear it sink, capturing the desperation of those convoy battles." Yet even as U-boats celebrated their happy time, the Allied response was gathering strength. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the Allies had been steadily improving their anti-submarine capabilities. New technologies were coming into play. Centimetric wavelength radar sets on patrol aircraft and escort ships could detect U-boats on the surface, even at night or in rough seas, far outperforming earlier radar systems. High-frequency direction finding or HUF-DUF equipment became standard on escort vessels, allowing them to intercept and pinpoint U-boat radio transmissions and thus locate wolf packs. Escort crews underwent better training in new tactics, including coordinated group maneuvers and creeping attacks guided by sound ranging, techniques pioneered by ace U-boat hunters like Captain Johnny Walker. The Royal Navy and US Navy introduced new weapons, such as the Hedgehog mortar that could hurl a pattern of depth charges ahead of a ship, and the Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo dropped from aircraft to chase down submerged submarines. Crucially, more escort ships were coming into service. Hardy new destroyer escorts and frigates designed for mass production, and additional long-range patrol aircraft like the B-24 Liberator closed the notorious mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort aircraft carriers and converted merchant aircraft carriers, MAC ships, began to accompany convoys or operate in roving support groups, bringing with them a small air wing to spot and attack U-boats far out to sea. Allied codebreakers were also contributing. By late 1942, British and American intelligence had largely cracked the German Enigma naval codes again, providing valuable ultra-intelligence on U-boat movements and rendezvous, though by May 1943, this advantage was less decisive than the sheer strength of convoy defences. All these improvements had been gradual, but by April 1943, they were coalescing into a formidable anti-submarine system. Still, the U-boat force under Admiral Karl Dönitz remained confident and aggressive. Over 160 German U-boats were operational, and Dönitz continuously fed new boats into the Atlantic patrol lines in hopes of overwhelming the convoys. This set the stage for an epic confrontation in May 1943, a month that would enter U-boat lore as Black May. In late April 1943, a slow westbound convoy, codenamed ONS-5, 42 merchant ships bound from Britain to North America, departed Liverpool. It carried a modest close escort of 6 warships, 2 destroyers, 1 frigate, and 4 corvettes, under Commander Peter Gretton. Unbeknownst to the convoy, Dönitz had massed a huge wolf pack to intercept it. Over 50 U-boats were deployed in patrol lines across the North Atlantic shipping routes. While no major convoy battles occurred in early April, by the end of the month, the U-boat arm was ready to relaunch coordinated attacks. On April 28, 1943, one of Dönitz's patrol lines made contact with ONS-5 in rough seas south of Greenland. At first, bad weather favoured the U-boats. Howling Atlantic gales scattered the convoy's ships and strained the escorts. Several German submarines, around 5 or 6, managed to shadow the convoy and strike. In the initial contacts, 1 merchant ship was torpedoed. Sensing a major battle, Western Approaches Command rushed additional help to Gretton's escort force. A newly formed support group, Escort Group 3, consisting of 5 British destroyers, was dispatched from St. John's, Newfoundland, to reinforce ONS-5. They arrived on April 30th, bringing the convoy's escort up to 14 warships. Faced with unexpectedly stiff resistance and meagre results, Dönitz briefly called off the attack on May 1st. However, the convoy's ordeal was far from over. The storm had forced some Allied escorts to refuel or return to port, temporarily thinning the protective screen. ONS-5, now delayed and straggling, blundered into another U-boat patrol line on May 4th, this one composed of 29 submarines lying in wait. Dönitz promptly ordered every available U-boat to converge on the convoy. What followed was one of the fiercest convoy battles of the war. As darkness fell on May 4th, dozens of U-boats pressed home attacks from all sides of ONS-5. The German torpedo salvos found targets. Over the nights of May 4th and 5th, the convoy lost 12 merchant ships sunk. The situation looked grim for the Allies. Gretton's escorts were stretched thin, trying to fend off numerous contacts in turbulent seas. But Allied advantages were beginning to tell. A Royal Canadian Air Force PBY Canso, flying from Newfoundland, had already caught U-209 as it approached and damaged it so severely that the U-boat sank a few days later. This long-range air patrol demonstrated that even the mid-ocean air gap was closing. By May, very long-range aircraft from Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland could just about cover the convoy routes. On May 5th, heavy fog rolled in, drastically reducing surface visibility. This shift favoured the Allied defenders. The fog blinded U-boat lookouts, while Allied radar could still sniff out submarine positions. Meanwhile, another support group, Escort Group 1, comprised of British sloops and frigates, arrived to bolster the convoy's protection. With calmer seas by May 6th, the escorts could make full use of their sonar and radar. The Hunter became the hunted. Allied warships vigorously pursued sonar contacts and launched a counteroffensive against the Wolfpack. Over May 5th to 6th, the escorts sank 5 U-boats, 4 by the convoy's close escort and 1 with help from the support group. Another U-boat had been destroyed earlier in the battle, making a total of 6 or 7 U-boats lost during the ONS-5 action. The tide had turned within the battle itself. What started as a potential disaster was flipped into a defensive victory by the convoy's reinforced escort. When Dönitz finally broke off the attack, the balance sheet was disastrous for Germany. About 13 merchant ships sunk at the cost of 7 U-boats destroyed. Nearly 40 U-boats had participated in the chase, but thanks to Allied tactics and technology, ONS-5 survived with the majority of its ships still safe. British authorities hailed the outcome as a decisive victory, and many historians later identified the Battle of ONS-5 as the turning point in the Atlantic War. One German U-boat man would dub it the Stalingrad at sea, a reference to the catastrophic defeat on the Eastern Front, while Allied sailors began to sense that the worst of the U-boat peril had passed. The defeat at ONS-5 was only the beginning of Germany's Black May. Throughout the month of May 1943, Admiral Dönitz continued to throw wolfpacks against the North Atlantic convoys, only to meet with mounting losses. The Allies, now bolstered by additional escorts and air cover, had effectively solved the wolfpack threat. Convoy HX-237, an eastbound convoy in mid-May, was protected by the British C-2 Escort Group and augmented by Escort Group 5, which included the escort carrier HMS Biter. When a U-boat pack targeted HX-237, the convoy's defenders fought off the assault. Carrier-borne aircraft and surface escorts combined to sink 3 U-boats, at the cost of only 3 straggling merchant ships lost from the convoy. Not long after, another Wolfpack pounced on convoy SC-129. This time, the Germans sank 2 merchant vessels. Kapitänleutnant Siegfried von Forstner of U-402 was only able to claim those 2 ships before Allied counterattacks drove the pack off. Reinforced by HMS Biter's support group, managed to destroy 1 U-boat during that engagement. As the U-boats moved in on SC-130 around May 18th to 20th, they found a formidable shield. 13 Allied warships, 9 in the close escort and 4 in a support group, guarded the convoy. With ample air support overhead, including very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, the U-boats never got the chance to inflict damage. Allied aircraft struck the gathering Wolfpack before it could mount a coordinated attack, scattering the submarines. Aggressive counterhunting by the escorts sank at least 1 U-boat, and patrolling RAF Liberator bombers destroyed another in the vicinity. By May 25th, convoy SC-130 arrived in Liverpool completely unscathed, an almost unthinkable outcome just a few months prior. Around the same time, convoy ON-184, outbound from the UK, was targeted by U-boats, but it too was heavily defended, including the presence of the US Navy escort carrier USS Bogue and her destroyer screen. The Wolfpack could not penetrate the convoy's strong escort. Not a single merchant was lost, while aircraft from Bogue managed to sink one of the lurking U-boats. Another fast eastbound convoy, HX-239, met a similar outcome. 8 escorts and the small carrier HMS Archer kept the U-boats at bay, and Archer's aircraft destroyed 1 submarine with no Allied ships lost. In engagement after engagement, the pattern had inverted from the dark days of March. Now it was the U-boats that were being hunted down in significant numbers, often for little or no success on their part. The cumulative toll on Dönitz's force was unprecedented. Allied reports at the time tallied approximately 34 U-boats destroyed in the Atlantic during May. Modern analysis shows the Germans actually lost about 40 U-boats in May 1943 from all causes worldwide, roughly 1/4 of their entire operational U-boat fleet, including at least 32 sunk in the North Atlantic convoy zone alone. For comparison, in the first 4 months of 1943, the average U-boat losses had been only 14 per month. Now, in a single month, the U-boat fleet was hemorrhaging boats and trained crews on a scale never seen before. According to detailed U-boat loss records, 42 U-boats were lost in May 1943, with 1,832 German submariners perishing and only 183 survivors rescued. It was by far the worst month of the war for Dönitz's undersea fleet, nearly 3 times the number of U-boats lost in the whole of 1941, as one analysis noted. Equally devastating was the qualitative loss. Many of the U-boat crews sunk in Black May included veteran and junior officers who would have formed the next generation of skilled U-boat captains. No amount of new U-boat production could immediately replace this human and material attrition. By contrast, Allied shipping losses in May 1943 fell dramatically. Only around 264,000 tons of merchant shipping were sunk that month, down from the peak in March. And, in the critical convoy battles of May, the U-boats managed to sink just 19 merchant ships, while losing 20 U-boats in those same convoy actions. Excluding the initial bloodletting at ONS-5, the exchanges in May were even more lopsided. Outside of ONS-5, the Wolfpacks in May 1943 sank a mere 6 ships for the loss of 13 U-boats. The advantage had swung decisively to the Allied side. The abrupt reversal of fortune in May 1943 sent shockwaves through the German Naval Command. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign and a former U-boat commander himself, was initially skeptical of the steep losses. He probed for explanations. Were Allied anti-submarine weapons and radar truly this effective, or were U-boat tactics at fault? Frontline U-boat captains reported being swarmed by destroyers, hunted by radar-equipped aircraft day and night, and facing sudden new threats like homing torpedoes. In late April, even before the worst battles, Dönitz had attempted a tactical adjustment to counter Allied air patrols. On April 27th, he ordered all U-boats crossing the Bay of Biscay, departing or returning to French bases, to do so submerged at night and to surface only briefly in daylight to recharge batteries. This order backfired. It inadvertently made U-boats more vulnerable by keeping them on the surface during daylight hours, when Allied aircraft hunted the Bay of Biscay aggressively. By May, Coastal Command's long-range aircraft were ravaging U-boats in transit. At least 6 U-boats were destroyed by air patrols over the bay that month. Morale among U-boat crews began to plummet as it became clear that the odds were now stacked against them on every sortie. The once aggressive Wolfpacks found themselves on the defensive, struggling just to survive relentless depth charge barrages and aerial attacks. One U-boat commander, after enduring repeated convoy battles in May, likened the experience to marching the crew to their doom, grimly aware that the U-boat arm's earlier confidence had given way to fatalism, as later recounted in war memoirs. Admiral Dönitz reached a fateful decision. With U-boat losses continuing at an unsustainable rate, he ordered a temporary halt to U-boat operations in the North Atlantic. All remaining submarines were to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes and regroup. He directed them to redeploy to areas beyond the range of land-based Allied air cover, for instance, the mid-Atlantic deep waters or other theatres, until new countermeasures or improved U-boat technologies could be developed. The North Atlantic, once the prime hunting ground of the Wolfpacks, was effectively vacated by the U-boats for several months. Dönitz's own war diary entries from late May 1943 record his shock at the frightful total of U-boats destroyed and describe Black May as a heavy and unexpected blow. Even Adolf Hitler, informed of the U-boat withdrawal, was dismayed. Hitler railed against the decision, but Dönitz knew there was no choice. To continue the North Atlantic campaign in June 1943 would be simply to condemn more U-boat crews to the depths for little gain. The U-boat force would attempt to come back later in the year, and indeed sporadic patrols resumed by the fall of 1943. But the halcyon days of Wolfpack dominance were over. Dönitz's capitulation in May 1943 was a pivotal strategic victory for the Allies. Black May has since been recognized as the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, after which the Allied control of the sea lanes steadily solidified. The U-boats, though they continued to fight and even introduced new technologies over the next 2 years, such as the snorkel for underwater running and revolutionary Type 21 U-boat designs, never regained the advantage or the impact they once had. Convoys sailed with increasing safety in the latter half of 1943 and into 1944. Allied shipbuilding now far outpaced losses, and the Wolfpack tactic that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1941-42 was essentially defeated. German U-boat production actually peaked later in 1943, and inexperienced new U-boat crews were still sent out, only to be met by even stronger Allied defenses and suffer heavy casualties. By mid-1943, the US and British navies were also taking the offensive, hunting U-boats in transit routes and in their coastal lairs. May 1943 thus marked the beginning of the end for the U-boat menace. Allied leaders, fully aware of the turnaround, immediately began reallocating resources from Atlantic convoy escort duty to support upcoming offensive operations in the Mediterranean and the invasion of France, confident that the critical North Atlantic lifeline was no longer in peril. Historians often compare the impact of Black May on the U-boat force to a decisive land battle. The phrase Stalingrad of the Atlantic has been invoked to describe the U-boat defeat, emphasizing how irrecoverable the losses were. The Allied victory in the Atlantic ensured that Britain would remain supplied, that American troops and material could safely cross the ocean, and that the Western Allies could build up for the eventual D-Day invasion. The strategic significance of winning the Atlantic War cannot be overstated. It was the prerequisite for all other Allied operations in Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic raged on to the war's end, but after Black May, the outcome was largely decided. The Atlantic lifeline was secure, and the German U-boat fleet had lost its bid to choke the Allies into submission. Black May stands as a testament to the convergence of Allied technology, strategy, and sacrifice, and it forever broke the back of the U-boat campaign, ending the last great threat to Allied control of the Atlantic. North Atlantic, winter 1940. A convoy pushes through heavy seas, engines straining, decks awash, crews on edge. Somewhere out there, unseen beneath the waves, a periscope breaks the surface. Without warning, a spread of torpedoes tears through the convoy. Explosions roll across the water as ships burn. By morning, 2 ships are gone. Their attacker dives and disappears before the escorts can even react. This was U-48, Germany's most successful U-boat. In less than 2 years of combat, it would sink more than 50 Allied vessels, over 300,000 tons of shipping, and become the standard by which every other U-boat was measured. This is the story of U-48, Germany's most lethal U-boat of World War II. U-48 was a Type 7B U-boat, an improved version of Germany's ubiquitous Type 7A. Laid down at the Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel and commissioned in April 1939, U-48 was 218 feet long, with a surface displacement of about 753 tons. The Type 7B design featured 5 torpedo tubes and carried up to 14 torpedoes. U-48 was also armed with an 8.8 cm deck gun and a 2 cm anti-aircraft cannon. Standard for U-boats early in the war, 2 diesel engines gave a top surface speed of around 18 knots and about 8 knots submerged. Crucially, the Type 7B had extended range, over 8,500 nautical miles at economic speed, which enabled patrols deep into the Atlantic. This formidable vessel was built for one primary role: commerce raiding in the Battle of the Atlantic. U-48 belonged to the 7th U-boat flotilla and was part of Admiral Dönitz's strategy to starve Britain by sinking merchant shipping. Just before war broke out on September 1st, 1939, U-48 had already put to sea on patrol, poised to attack Allied ships as soon as hostilities began. The boat's long range and improved torpedo load made it ideal for hunting convoys. The U-boat would operate from German ports initially, and after France fell in mid-1940, from the new U-boat bases on the Bay of Biscay, maximizing its reach into the Atlantic. With a crew of roughly 45 men, including highly trained officers, U-48 was a cutting-edge predator of its time. Under the command of Kapitänleutnant Herbert Schulze, U-48 commenced its first war patrol within days of the invasion of Poland. In September 1939, it patrolled the shipping lanes west of Britain and sank 3 merchant ships, grossing 14,777 tons in shipping on its maiden patrol. One of these victims was the British freighter Royal Scepter. In a notable display of early war chivalry, Schulze allowed Royal Scepter's crew to abandon ship and even signalled a nearby neutral vessel, SS Browning, to rescue the survivors. After sinking the steamer Furby on that same patrol, Schulze sent a cheeky open radio message addressed to Winston Churchill, giving the ship's coordinates and requesting rescue for its crew. These gestures, while propagandistic, showed Schulze's adherence to prize rules at the war's outset. U-48's second and third patrols in October and November 1939 were even more devastating to Allied shipping. Schulze roamed the western approaches, sending ship after ship to the bottom. In October, U-48 sank 5 vessels, including the large French tanker SS Émile Maguet, and then another 4 ships in November-December. By the end of 1939, U-48 had sunk over a dozen ships, establishing itself as one of the Kriegsmarine's rising stars. Schulze's successes earned him the Knight's Cross in March 1940, one of the first U-boat commanders to be so honoured. U-48 continued its streak into 1940. On its 4th patrol from January to February 1940, the submarine operated in the North Sea and North Atlantic, notching additional kills amidst the winter seas. In April 1940, during the Norwegian campaign, U-48 even attempted an audacious attack on the Royal Navy. It tried to penetrate the escort screen of the British battleship HMS Warspite, only to be chased off by vigilant destroyers who pummeled U-48 with depth charges. The U-boat escaped with minor damage, a narrow miss during an operation that showed the increasing risks as Allied anti-submarine efforts stiffened. In spring 1940, Schulze fell ill with a severe stomach and kidney ailment and had to relinquish command. Korvettenkapitän Hans Rudolf Rosing took over U-48 in May 1940, just as Germany's position improved with the fall of France. Now operating from captured French Atlantic ports, U-48 could undertake longer patrols and reach hunting grounds previously beyond range. Rosing's first patrol in June 1940 proved one of U-48's most successful. Refueling in newly available bases in Norway extended their mission, allowing U-48 to sink 8 ships on that single patrol, an astonishing haul. Among these were stragglers and convoy ships in the eastern Atlantic that fell victim to U-48's torpedoes. On a subsequent patrol in August 1940, Rosing added 5 more sinkings before bringing U-48 into the U-boat base at Lorient, France. By the end of the summer, U-48's kill count had surpassed 20 ships, and Rosing himself was awarded the Knight's Cross for his success. In August 1940, U-48 joined other U-boats in a coordinated wolf pack for the first time, codenamed Rosing after its commander, striking convoy HX-65, sinking 2 freighters before enduring a depth charge attack by HMS Godathia and escaping underwater. This was guerrilla warfare at sea, hit-and-run torpedo attacks at night, followed by harrowing cat-and-mouse evasions from escorts. In these engagements, U-48 demonstrated the tactics that made U-boats so feared. One night in late March 1941, U-48 even steered into the middle of convoy HX-115 and boldly attacked while running among the merchant columns on the surface. Several armed freighters fired back and attempted to ram the U-boat, but U-48 weaved through the chaos, dodged the would-be rammers, and slipped away before the convoy's escorts could react. Such daring maneuvers underscored the skill of U-48's crew and the bold leadership of its commanders. In September 1940, Heinrich Ajax Bleichrodt took command, and U-48's 8th War Patrol soon became infamous. Patrolling north of Ireland and south of Greenland, U-48 attacked convoy ships relentlessly. On September 17, 1940, Bleichrodt torpedoed the passenger liner SS City of Benares, tragically sinking it. 90 of the 119 on board were killed, among over 250 total dead. The sinking of City of Benares shocked public opinion in Britain and abroad, and led to Bleichrodt being labelled a war criminal by the British press. After the war, Bleichrodt was indeed accused of a war crime for this sinking, though he was ultimately acquitted in 1946. The controversy has endured. The ship sailed in a convoy at night with no special markings. Regardless, the incident stands as a grim reminder of the human cost of the U-boat campaign. Notwithstanding the tragedy, U-48's 8th Patrol was devastatingly effective militarily. In the span of 6 days, U-48 sank City of Benares and 7 other ships from convoys SC-3 and OB-213. Among these victims during Bleichrodt's patrol was the British warship HMS Dundee, a Royal Navy sloop of about 1,060 tons, which U-48 sent to the bottom. This was the single warship kill during its career. By patrol's end, Bleichrodt had sunk 8 ships totaling over 36,000 tons. German propaganda trumpeted even higher figures. Bleichrodt's next sortie in October 1940 was similarly successful, adding another 8 merchant ships, 43,000 tons, to U-48's tally. By late 1940, U-48 had become a true ace of the deep, with its consecutive commanders, Schulze, Rosing, and Bleichrodt, all among the top U-boat skippers in confirmed sinkings. In December 1940, Herbert Schulze, recovered from illness, returned to U-48's bridge, relieving Bleichrodt. However, the U-boat war was evolving. The Royal Navy and Allied forces were improving convoy defences with better escort tactics, radar, and air patrols, making U-boat operations riskier. U-48 undertook a few final war patrols under Schulze in early 1941. It still scored successes, sinking 2 ships on its 9th patrol and 5 on its 10th patrol, but the happy times were waning. By now, the veteran U-48 was considered technologically obsolete compared to newer boats. Its relatively short range and limited torpedo load were becoming liabilities as the battle spread across broader oceans. After a winter refit in early 1941, U-48 found itself increasingly outrun by improved Allied anti-submarine measures and the need for longer missions. U-48's 12th and final war patrol came in May-June 1941. Notably, during this patrol, U-48 joined the Wolfpack West, June 2nd to 8th, 1941, one of the coordinated group attacks that Donitz was deploying against convoys in its final patrols. The boat still managed to sink several more ships, 5 vessels on the last patrol, bringing its career total to an astounding 51 merchant ships and 1 escort. On June 22nd, 1941, U-48 returned to Kiel from patrol for the last time. In 2 years of combat, it had conducted 12 war patrols and was credited with sinking over 50 ships, totaling more than 300,000 tons of Allied shipping, a record unmatched by any other submarine in World War II. Remarkably, throughout all these battles, U-48 never lost a single crewman to enemy action or accident during its operational career. By mid-1941, the Kriegsmarine decided that U-48 had earned its retirement from frontline service. The trusty boat was withdrawn from combat and assigned to training duties with the 26th U-boat flotilla in the Baltic. For the next 2 years, U-48 served as a schoolboat, helping to train a new generation of U-boat crews. Its veteran hull and systems were valuable for instructing cadets, even if no longer ideal for battle. As the war wore on, U-48 itself began showing its age. In 1943, the Navy deemed the submarine unfit even for training, likely due to wear and tear and the general decline in Germany's resources. U-48 was formally decommissioned on September 25, 1943. The boat was laid up at Neustadt in Holstein, on the Baltic coast of Germany, kept barely operational by only a skeleton maintenance crew. U-48 remained through the final years of the war, moored and silent, while Allied bombs rained on the Third Reich. In May 1945, as British forces advanced into northern Germany, U-48's custodians took action to prevent its capture. On May 3, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, U-48's crew scuttled the submarine in the Bay of Lübeck, off Neustadt. The once deadly U-boat was deliberately sunk in shallow coastal waters, its crew ensuring it would not fall into Allied hands. Thus, U-48 never fell to enemy attack. It was destroyed by its own men at the war's end. The wreck of U-48 remains at the bottom of Lübeck Bay, a submerged relic of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-48 holds a special place in naval history as the most successful U-boat of World War II. In terms of tonnage sunk, no other submarine, German or Allied, matched U-48's devastating record of over 306,000 tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom. This single U-boat had effectively waged a one-vessel commerce war, especially during 1939 to 1940, when Allied anti-submarine defences were still catching up. Its achievements were a significant contribution to the first happy time, that early war period when U-boats ravaged Atlantic convoys almost at will. U-48's story is often cited to illustrate the potency of German U-boats and the high tide of the U-boat campaign before Allied countermeasures turned the tables. U-48's commanders and crew left an enduring legacy. 7 crewmen from U-48 eventually earned the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest award for valor, including all 3 of its wartime skippers. Herbert Schulze, the first and longest-serving commander of U-48, became a U-boat flotilla commander, and later served on Admiral Donitz's staff. Schulze survived World War II and even joined West Germany's post-war navy, Bundesmarine, in 1956, retiring as a Kapitän zur See, naval captain, in 1968. He was remembered by comrades as an exemplary naval officer in the best tradition. Hans Rudolf Rosing, who led U-48 through the successful summer of 1940, went on to important staff roles, including commander of U-Boats West in 1942 to 1944, directing Atlantic operations. Rosing also joined the post-war Bundesmarine and rose to the rank of Konteradmiral, Rear Admiral, before retiring in 1965. Heinrich Bleichrodt continued active U-boat command, sinking more ships on later patrols, notably with U-109, and receiving oak leaves to his Knight's Cross. Though shadowed by the City of Benares incident, Bleichrodt survived the war and lived until 1977. The careers of U-48's commanders after 1941 illustrate how highly regarded these men were. The boat effectively served as a proving ground for U-boat aces, who later took on senior roles. In all, the U-boat's 2-year rampage, from the opening of hostilities to mid-1941, encapsulates the arc of the U-boat war. Initial overwhelming success, the adaptation of Allied defences, and the eventual decline of the U-boat's dominance. While its hull rests quietly under Baltic waters, the legend of U-48 endures as a reminder of how one small vessel, skillfully captained, came to terrorize the Atlantic, becoming one of the deadliest vessels ever put to sea. May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but beneath the Atlantic, a lone German U-boat still prowls on a secret mission. U-234, a long-range Type 10B U-boat dispatched in the Reich's final days to deliver critical technology, carrying an unlikely cargo of Nazi engineers, jet plane parts, and uranium oxide destined for a Japanese atomic research program. This is the story of U-234's last voyage, a doomed delivery that arrived not in Tokyo, but in the hands of the Allies. U-234 was no ordinary U-boat. Laid down in 1941 and commissioned in early 1944, she was a Type 10B submarine, the largest class Germany built during the war. Originally designed as a mine layer, she stretched 294 feet, featuring extra storage for dozens of huge naval mines. However, the demands of war would see her converted from a mine dispenser into an underwater freighter. In late 1944, U-234 returned to the Kiel shipyard for refitting as a transport sub. A snorkel breathing mast was installed for extended submerged travel, and half her mine shafts were refitted with cylindrical cargo containers that could be loaded and released like mines. Her keel was also packed with heavy cargo, tons of lead, mercury, and optical glass, and even her spare torpedo compartments were crammed with freight. These modifications gave U-234 an enormous payload capacity of around 240 to 300 tons of cargo, albeit at the cost of speed and maneuverability. She was, in effect, a slow-moving undersea cargo ship. By late 1944, this purpose had become critical. With Allied navies strangling surface supply lines, Germany and Japan, Axis partners separated by half the globe, had turned to submarines to exchange technology and resources. U-234 was hand-picked for a last-ditch voyage to Japan, carrying advanced weapons and technical experts to bolster the faltering Japanese war effort. Though Kapitänleutnant Johann Heinrich Fehler, U-234's 33-year-old commander, had hoped for a combat command, he was instead tasked with piloting this oversized U-boat on a long-range clandestine delivery mission. It was a disappointment for the career submariner, but also an assignment of great importance. Nazi leadership hoped that U-234's cargo might help Japan hold out longer against the Americans, tying down Allied forces even as Germany itself faced defeat. In essence, U-234 became a lifeline, a final gift from a collapsing Reich to its last remaining ally. Aside from training exercises, U-234 had no traditional combat patrols. Her wartime service was brief and singularly focused on preparing for the mission to Japan. After commissioning in mid-1944, U-234 spent months up in the Baltic before heading back to the yard for her transport conversion. In March 1945, with modifications complete and cargo loaded, Fehler took U-234 to sea for shakedown trials. During snorkel tests in the Kattegat, the large U-boat even collided with a smaller German sub, a minor scrape that punched a dent but did not derail the mission. By this point, Germany's situation was dire. In late 1944 and early 1945, Allied armies were overrunning the Reich from both west and east. Still, U-234's crew and passengers remained committed to their journey. On March 25, 1945, the submarine sailed from Kiel, Germany, bound for Norway as a staging point. Navigating under escort, U-234 reached the Kristiansand base in southern Norway in early April. There, final repairs were made and fresh provisions and diesel fuel were taken aboard for the long voyage ahead. Fehler knew the odds were against them. By his own admission, he was dubious that the mission could succeed amid Allied dominance of the seas. On the evening of April 15, 1945, U-234 slipped out of Kristiansand and dove beneath the North Sea, setting a course for the Far East. The U-boat's initial tactics were those of survival, run deep and silent. For the first 16 days, Fehler kept U-234 submerged almost continuously at snorkel depth, creeping along to avoid detection. Only after painstakingly rounding Scotland and escaping the Allied patrolled North Atlantic approaches did he dare surface at night. Even then, in late April, the weather dealt a hand. A ferocious Atlantic storm provided natural cover, allowing U-234 to run on the surface for 2 hours each night to recharge batteries. As April turned to May, the U-boat pressed westward, still undetected, and holding to the faint hope of reaching Japanese waters. By early May 1945, world events were rapidly overtaking U-234's voyage. The crew noticed ominous signs. Scheduled German radio transmissions went silent, one by one. On May 4th, while running at periscope depth, U-234 caught fragments of broadcasts mentioning Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz assuming leadership after Hitler's death. Failer was alarmed, but unsure what to believe. On May 10th, as U-234 surfaced to improve reception, the truth arrived. The Reich had surrendered. All U-boats at sea were ordered to surface and give themselves up. For U-234, still roughly in the middle of North America and Europe, it was decision time. Kapitän-Leutnant Failer hesitated. Was the message real or an Allied trick? Only after contacting another U-boat, U-873, did he accept that the war in Europe was indeed over. The Japanese officers on board, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tominaga and Lieutenant Commander Genzo Shoji, now faced an agonizing fate: surrender to an enemy or death with honor. Both chose the latter. Sometime around May 12th, the two men overdosed on luminol and fell into eternal sleep in their bunks. In a solemn ceremony, Failer ordered their bodies sewn into weighted canvas and sent overboard into the deep Atlantic. Then broke radio silence to report her intent to surrender. Cunningly, Failer gave a false destination of Halifax, Nova Scotia, hoping to avoid interception by Canadian or British forces. Privately, he steered the U-boat toward the US East Coast, reasoning that surrendering to Americans might mean better treatment and a quicker repatriation for his men. It nearly worked. U-234 headed westward on the surface under white flags, until the US Navy caught on that her course did not match the Halifax claim. On May 14th, 1945, south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, the U-boat was intercepted by the American destroyer escort USS Sutton DE-771. With no resistance, U-234 formally surrendered. An American crew clambered aboard, and Kapitän-Leutnant Failer handed over his sidearm. The captured sub was escorted toward the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, a major U-boat surrender collection point. Along the way, there were brief stops, according to some accounts, at Newfoundland and at Casco Bay, Maine. Finally, on May 19, 1945, U-234 arrived in Portsmouth to much fanfare. News of U-234's dramatic arrival, carrying high-ranking German officials and 2 dead Japanese personnel buried at sea en route, made headlines. The moment marked the end of U-234's voyage, but the beginning of the unraveling of her many secrets. Even before U-234 docked, rumors swirled about what she had been carrying for Japan. US Navy intelligence was well aware this submarine was a special courier. To keep prying eyes away, sailors erected tarpaulins around U-234 as they began unloading 300 tons of cargo in secret. What emerged was a treasure trove of advanced weaponry and resources. According to later inventories, U-234's holds contained technical drawings and blueprints by the caseful, examples of Germany's newest electric guidance torpedoes, one complete Messerschmitt Me-26 jet fighter in crates, and even a winged Henschel HS-293 guided bomb. There were crates of optical glass, radar equipment, explosives, and pharmaceuticals, plus 26 tons of mercury and 74 tons of lead, raw materials in desperate shortage in Japan. The sub even carried 1 ton of mail intended for German officials in Asia, underscoring how isolated Japan had become by 1945. Most astonishing of all was a collection of 10 steel cylinders labeled U-235, part of a consignment tagged for the Japanese army. When opened under laboratory conditions, these containers held roughly 550 to 560 kilograms of uranium oxide powder. The German crew had been warned never to open the mysterious cans, told that the contents could be deadly if exposed. At the time, the discovery of uranium was kept highly classified. It would remain a Cold War secret for decades. We now know that Nazi Germany did not have any capability to enrich uranium to a bomb-ready state. Their atomic program was far behind. However, Japan had shown keen interest in obtaining nuclear materials. Officially, German records claimed the uranium was requested for use as a catalyst in making synthetic aviation fuel. Unofficially, Japanese scientists at the Riken Research Institute in Tokyo were experimenting with rudimentary thermal diffusion methods to enrich uranium as part of a preliminary and ultimately fruitless Japanese atomic project. In fact, U-234's uranium shipment was likely bound for the Riken lab, though in a twist of fate, Allied bombers had destroyed that very lab in April 1945, just days before the sub set sail. Whether Japan could have done anything significant with 560 kilograms of unrefined uranium oxide so late in the war is doubtful. But its presence aboard speaks volumes about the desperation and last hopes of the Axis powers. The human cargo of U-234 was equally notable. There were 12 passengers plus the U-boat crew, a roster of specialists chosen to aid Japan. Leading them was Luftwaffe General Ulrich Kessler, assigned to be an Air Force liaison in Tokyo. Alongside him were two colonels, K. Nischling, a naval judge advocate, and Herbert Sandrart of the Luftwaffe, tasked with security and technical roles, as well as several civilian engineers. One passenger, Dr. Heinz Schlicker, was an electronics and radar expert, who later would be scooped up by the United States under Operation Paperclip to work on American technology. Another, August Bringerwald, had overseen jet production at Messerschmitt. He likely accompanied the crated jet on U-234 to assist Japanese engineers. Perhaps the most mysterious riders were the two Japanese naval officers, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tominaga and Lieutenant Commander Genzo Shoji. Tominaga was a submarine designer and naval architect who had been in Germany since 1943. He himself arrived by submarine. Shoji was an aviation and aircraft specialist, formerly a naval attaché in Berlin. Both were essentially technical liaisons, now returning to Japan with first-hand knowledge of German advancements. In death, they became symbols of the profound link and ultimate failure of the German-Japanese wartime partnership. The seizure of U-234 handed the Allies a windfall of intelligence at a crucial moment. In May 1945, the war against Japan was still raging, and US planners were anxious to gauge how German aid might boost Japan's defense. The U-boat's advanced weapons samples and blueprints were shipped to US technical centers. For example, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was sent to Wright Field in Ohio for Air Force evaluation. Perhaps most impactful was the trove of documents and prototypes related to radar, guided missiles, and other late-war innovations, which gave the Allies insight into both German and Japanese capabilities. U-234's high-profile passengers, including General Kessler and Captain Lieutenant Fehler, were flown to Washington, D.C. for extensive interrogation, a sign of the intelligence value placed on them. American secrecy endured into the post-war years. The fact that a large quantity of uranium had been found was kept classified throughout the Cold War, feeding many conspiracy theories. In reality, the uranium oxide was swiftly turned over to the US Army's Manhattan Project, the top-secret program racing to build atomic bombs. By late June 1945, the captured material had been shipped to the Manhattan Project's Clinton Engineer Works in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, presumably for test processing or enrichment. This has led to mass speculation. Some sources have claimed that the uranium from U-234 was indeed enriched and contributed to the Little Boy atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The notion is alluring. The idea that Nazi uranium intended for Japan ended up fueling a bomb against Japan, yet most historians remain skeptical. The timing was extremely tight. According to Major John Lansdale, the Manhattan Project security chief, the material did reach Oak Ridge and may have been added to the enrichment stream, but likely too late to make it into the first bombs. More plausibly, it became part of America's growing post-war uranium stockpile and research supply. The exact fate of U-234's uranium remains unconfirmed, an enduring historical question mark, an echo of the larger unknowns about how close the Axis powers ever got to an atomic capability. As for U-234 herself, she never returned to sea under a flag. After exhaustive testing of the captured U-boat's design and performance against new US submarines, the Navy had little use for the vessel. On November 20, 1947, off Cape Cod, the once secret submarine was consigned to a dramatic end, used as a target in a live fire exercise. The American submarine USS Greenfish fired a torpedo into U-234, sending the U-boat to the bottom in a column of spray and fire. With that, U-234's saga finally concluded beneath the cold Atlantic swells. And yet, the legacy lives on as a haunting footnote of World War II. This single U-boat's journey encapsulated the last gasp of Nazi-Japanese cooperation, highlighting both its grand ambitions and its ultimate futility. The mission revealed not only technological wonders, jet planes, guided bombs, and uranium that foreshadowed the dawn of the atomic age, but also the fundamental disconnects between two desperate allies. German and Japanese planners never fully trusted each other and often struggled to bridge differences in manufacturing and science culture. Even as Japan hungered for German innovations to resist defeat, the dysfunction and delays meant that U-234's gifts would have arrived too late to matter. In the end, U-234's voyage achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of prolonging Axis resistance, it furnished the Allies with invaluable intelligence and possibly a boost, however slight, to the very atomic bomb program that would hasten Japan's surrender. Just after midnight on the 14th of May 1945, on the grounds of the Naval Academy, a sentry called out for identification and the password. The figure walking across the academy grounds did not answer. The sentry challenged again. Still nothing. Then he fired. The bullet struck Wolfgang Luth in the head and killed him instantly. It was an absurd ending for one of Germany's most famous submarine commanders. Luth had survived the North Sea, the Atlantic, the Cape Routes, the Indian Ocean, and some of the longest patrols any U-boat commander endured during the entire war. He had sunk more than 225,000 tons of Allied shipping, received every major step of Germany's most prestigious wartime decoration, and become one of the great public faces of the U-boat arm. 2 days later, Karl Dönitz stood over his grave and delivered the eulogy at what became the last state funeral of the Third Reich. It was a fittingly strange end for a man whose whole career had been strange. This is the story of Wolfgang Luth. Wolfgang August Eugen Luth was born on the 15th of October 1913 in Riga, in what was then the Russian Empire, into the Baltic German world that still stood between the old imperial order and the modern nation-states that would replace it. He studied law briefly, then abandoned it and entered the Reichsmarine on April 1st, 1933. Like many naval officers of his generation, he did not begin in submarines. His early years were spent the traditional way, training aboard the sailing ship Gorsch Fock, a long instructional voyage on the light cruiser Karlsruhe, then service in the cruiser Königsberg. Only in February 1937 did he transfer into the U-boat arm. He served first as watch officer on U-27 and then on U-38 under Heinrich Lieber, gaining operational experience before receiving a command of his own. That conventional beginning is important, because almost everything that followed was unconventional. Luth was not physically imposing, not polished, not especially diplomatic, and not universally liked. Even among a service full of hard men, he developed a reputation for being tactless, intrusive, and unusually moralistic about the private lives of others. At the same time, he was also ambitious, intense, and unmistakably political. Unlike many naval officers who kept ideology at a careful distance, Luth openly embraced National Socialism and made no effort to hide it. That alone made him stand out in the Kriegsmarine. But it was only one part of what made him different. Luth's first real command was U-9, a small Type 2B coastal boat, which he took over at the end of December 1939. These were cramped, short-range submarines, closer to ambush weapons than ocean raiders, and they gave him few opportunities for glory at first. His opening patrols in the North Sea produced modest sinkings, not headlines. During the Norwegian campaign, he even fired 4 magnetic torpedoes at the Polish destroyer Grom off Bergen and saw them all fail or miss. For a younger commander, that might have been the most memorable moment of an otherwise unremarkable spring. Instead, Luth found something more distinctive. On May 9th, 1940, U-9 intercepted the French submarine Doris off the Dutch coast. Luth had tracked a mixed Allied submarine group through daylight and waited until darkness to strike. Under a bright moon, Doris was silhouetted cleanly enough for a close attack. 2 torpedoes hit. According to the German war diary, the French boat vanished in a towering explosion within a minute. It was an unusual kill, even in the submarine war, one submarine destroying another at sea. Days later, he also sank the merchant ships Viu and Tringa, and later Sigurd Falbaum. By the time he left U9 in June 1940, he had established himself as a man who could turn limited opportunity into measurable results. His next boat, U-138, made his name. She was a Type 2D, another small coastal submarine, but Luth used her with extraordinary aggression. On the night of the 20th to the 21st of September, 1940, attacking convoy OB-216 in the western approaches, he sank New Sevilla, Boca, City of Simla, and Empire Adventure in a single patrol. On the next patrol, he sank Bonheur and damaged the tanker British Glory. That performance won him the Knight's Cross on October 24, 1940, making him the only commander of a coastal U-boat to receive the decoration. In just a few months, Luth had moved from obscure small boat captain to one of the rising stars of Dönitz's arm. In October 1940, he moved again, this time into U-43, a long-range Type 9 U-boat. Here, Luth should have become a more conventional U-boat ace, and in numerical terms, he did. Over 5 patrols in U-43, he sank 12 ships totaling more than 68,000 tons. In December 1940, he struck convoy OB-251 and sent Pacific President and Victor Ross to the bottom, then sank the Norwegian merchantman Scrim days later. Other patrols brought more victims: Eiselhaven, Catherine, Thornleybank, Ashby, the Swedish Ingaren, the British Empire Surf, and the American-owned Chepo. He also damaged Durari and sank the American tanker Astral in December 1941, just days before Germany's formal declaration of war on the United States. But U-43 also produced one of the strangest episodes of his career. On February 4, 1941, while moored in Lorient and preparing for another patrol, the boat flooded and sank at the dock. An open valve and poor supervision were enough to send a frontline U-boat to the harbour bottom. A less favoured commander might have seen his command and career end there. Luth did not. U-43 was refloated, repaired, and returned to sea, and so did he. That survival mattered. It showed how highly he was already regarded, and how much Dönitz believed his results outweighed his mistakes. This was the phase in which his reputation began to harden. He could be extraordinarily cold in action, with a clarity that other officers sometimes found disturbing. After sinking Doris, he later reduced the matter to its essential logic: it is either you or me. That was not an unusual sentiment in submarine warfare, but with Luth, it seemed more complete, more stripped of sentiment. He was a professional predator, and other U-boatmen noticed it. Some admired the hardness, some were unsettled by it. Both reactions followed him for the rest of the war. The decisive turn in Luth's career came in May 1942, when he took command of U-181, the newer Type 9D2 long-range U-boat built for distant waters. These were not boats for the North Atlantic convoy battle in the narrow sense. They were endurance machines, designed to reach where escorts were thin, air cover was limited, and sheer distance became a weapon. Luth sailed from Kiel on September 12, 1942, and headed south for the Cape routes and the Indian Ocean. That decision placed him in the theatre that would make his wartime legend. By late October, he was operating off Cape Town. There, he sank East Indian, Plaudit, KG Meldal, and Excello. He learned by signal that he had been awarded the Oak Leaves. 2 days later came perhaps the hardest test of his operational career. The British destroyer HMS Inconstant, joined by the corvettes HMS Jasmine and HMS Nigella, drove U-181 deep and kept her under pressure for hours. The attack lasted roughly 9 hours and forced the submarine to extreme depth before Luth escaped in darkness and the confusion of the explosions. It was a reminder that for all the easier opportunities southern waters sometimes offered, a single competent escort group could still turn a patrol into a near disaster. After making repairs, Luth shifted toward Lourenço Marques and Mozambique waters, where the patrol became a massacre of dispersed merchant shipping. Between November 19th and December 2nd, 1942, U-181 sank Gunda, Corinthiakos, Alcoa Pathfinder, Mount Helmos, Dorrington Court, Evanthia, Clynthis, and Amaryllis. Much of this was done on the surface, and by the end of the run, U-181 had exhausted all 355 rounds of her deck gun ammunition. When the patrol ended at Bordeaux on the 18th of January 1943, Luth had sunk 12 ships for 58,381 tons. It was one of the most successful U-boat patrols of the war. His second patrol with the boat was even more revealing. Leaving Bordeaux on March 23, 1943, Luth spent 206 days at sea, making it the second longest U-boat patrol of the war. The route took him again into African and Indian Ocean waters. He sank Empire Wimbrel in April, Tin Hau in May, the small vessel Harrier in June, then farther east the passenger cargo ship Hoi Hao on July 2nd, followed by Empire Lake, Fort Franklin, Dalfram, Umvuma, and Clan MacArthur in July and August. In June, east of Mauritius, U-181 refueled from the supply ship Charlotte Schliemann in the company of other long-range boats operating in the Indian Ocean, among them U-177, U-178, U-196, U-197, and U-198. This was a different U-boat war from the North Atlantic convoy struggle, more dispersed, farther from air cover, and more dependent on endurance than tactical brilliance. Luth excelled in it. That second patrol brought 10 more sinkings for 45,000 tons. It also brought the awards that completed his rise: the Swords in April 1943, and the Diamonds on August 9, 1943, making him the first U-boat officer to receive the full progression of Knight's Cross, Oak Leaves, Swords, and Diamonds. By the time he returned to Bordeaux in October, he ranked second only to Otto Kretschmer in merchant tonnage sunk. His military stature was now beyond dispute. The deeper question was what sort of man had achieved it. Luth's strangeness did not lie in his tonnage total. It lay in the contradictions that sat behind it. He was, by almost every account, both severe and paternal. He could be rude, meddling, and doctrinaire ashore, yet intensely attentive to the state of his men at sea. On the long U-181 patrols, he treated morale as an operational problem that had to be managed with the same seriousness as fuel and torpedoes. He published a shipboard newspaper. He organized competitions, card tournaments, drawing contests, singing contests over the address system, mock Olympic Games, and elaborate birthday and holiday celebrations. Crossing the equator became an orchestrated ritual. Christmas was marked with presents, songs, and a tree improvised from green toilet paper. One of his own stated principles was simple: the spirit of the crew depends mainly on an exemplary officer's corps. On that point, he was utterly serious. But the same man also forbade pin-ups and what he considered unhealthy reading, regulated cigarettes and alcohol, meddled in the romantic lives of his men, urged marriage and children, and tried to keep sailors away from brothels. He turned command into a kind of moral guardianship. Other U-boat commanders, especially those fighting in the far deadlier North Atlantic escort belt, sometimes regarded these ideas as naive or faintly absurd. And yet, Luth's crews remained fiercely loyal to him. Prize winners in his contests could earn something more valuable than money or leave. The captain would stand their watch for them. That single habit said more about his authority than any medal ever could. This was the paradox. Luth was openly ideological, unusually prudish, and capable of striking moral blindness about the destruction he caused. At the same time, he was probably one of the most thoughtful commanders in the German U-boat force when it came to the psychological burden of underwater war. His men remembered both sides of him. Years later, one crewman would say simply, "There are no men like him anymore." That kind of loyalty cannot be created by propaganda alone. It has to be earned inside the steel hull of a boat, day after day, watch after watch, over months at sea. Luth left operations in January 1944 after more than 5 years of almost uninterrupted U-boat duty, 15 patrols, and 640 days at sea. He was given command of the 22nd U-boat flotilla at Gotenhafen, where future commanders were trained, and in July 1944 moved to the Naval Academy at Flensburg-Meervik. By September, he was the Academy's commander and the youngest officer ever to hold the post. It was a position of prestige, and it reflected how highly Dönitz rated him. Even after the war was materially lost, Luth remained one of the men the leadership still trusted to shape the future officer corps. That future never came. After the British occupation of Flensburg on May 5, 1945, Academy routine continued briefly in the strange limbo of the Dönitz government. Then, a week later, Luth was crossing the Academy grounds after midnight and failed to answer a sentry's challenge. The sentry, 18-year-old seaman Matthias Gottlob, fired into the darkness and killed him with a single shot. Later, speculation ranged from exhaustion to drink to deliberate suicide. The official inquiry cleared the sentry of wrongdoing. He had given the challenge and received no answer. For Luth, who had spent his career enforcing discipline and demanding obedience, there was a certain brutal logic in that ending. On the 16th of May 1945, he was buried with full ceremony. Dönitz delivered the eulogy. 6 decorated U-boat officers formed the honor guard. It was the last state funeral of the Third Reich. The symbolism was almost too precise. One of Germany's most decorated naval officers, buried by a dead regime after the war had already ended, his career closing not in battle, but in confusion, ritual, and collapse. Luth's place in history remains difficult to summarize neatly. His achievements were real. He sank enormous tonnage and commanded some of the most successful long-range patrols of the war. His leadership methods influenced training and became famous in their own right. Yet his record also sat partly in African and Indian Ocean waters that were less heavily defended than the North Atlantic killing grounds, and his open devotion to Nazism complicates any easy treatment of him as merely a brilliant naval officer. He was, in the end, exactly what his career suggests: able, charismatic, hard, ideological, paternal, eccentric, and deeply contradictory. That is why Wolfgang Luth remains such a singular figure in the history of the U-boat war. He was not simply an ace. He was not simply a fanatic. He was not simply a leader of men. He was all of those things at once, held together inside one of the strangest careers the U-boat war produced. He survived 15 patrols and hundreds of days at sea, only to die on land after the war was over, under the rules he had spent a lifetime teaching others to obey. March 1941. South of Iceland, the Atlantic is dark and rough as U-47 hunts convoy OB-293. Inside the boat, the crew moves quietly between the control room and torpedo compartments, while Commander Günther Prien sends one last short signal back to base. Then the radio falls silent. A distress call never follows. No survivor is ever seen. The U-boat simply disappears into the Atlantic. By the end of the Second World War, Germany had lost hundreds of U-boats across the Atlantic, Arctic, and Mediterranean. Most can be tied to a known attack, a minefield, or a final battle. But dozens cannot. They sail out, send their last report, and are never heard from again. This is the story of the U-boats that went missing in World War II. Over the course of the war, Germany built more than 1,100 U-boats and lost roughly 780 of them. Tens of thousands of men served aboard these boats, and most never survived the war. For many crews, a patrol was not just dangerous. It was more likely to end in death than in survival. Most of those losses fit within the broader pattern of the Atlantic War. Some U-boats were destroyed in convoy battles by escort groups that found them, held contact, and attacked repeatedly until the boat was finished. Others were caught on the surface by aircraft, especially once radar and long-range patrol coverage expanded across the Atlantic. Some struck minefields in the North Sea, the Bay of Biscay, or the narrow approaches to heavily defended waters. Others were lost in port, scuttled at the end of the war, or destroyed under circumstances that were still clear enough to enter into the record with reasonable confidence. But not all of them. A smaller group remained outside that certainty. These boats left port, entered their patrol areas, sent their routine signals, and then disappeared. In some cases, there was a likely explanation. In others, there was barely more than a final position report and a boat that never came home. They were lost without a confirmed ending. The most famous of all the missing U-boats was U-47. By March 1941, it was already one of the best-known boats in the German Navy. Under Günther Prien, it had slipped into Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sunk the battleship Royal Oak, making both the boat and its commander symbols of the early U-boat war. But on March 7, 1941, while operating against convoy OB-293 south of Iceland, U-47 sent its last signal and was never heard from again. For years, one British destroyer attack in the area was widely accepted as the explanation. A later study cast doubt on that conclusion. Other possibilities remained, including a mine or an internal torpedo accident. None could be proved. One of Germany's most celebrated U-boats had disappeared without a confirmed end. U-122 was lost much earlier, in 1940, when the Atlantic campaign was still taking shape. It had been operating in dangerous waters where British minefields already posed a major threat to any boat moving in or out of patrol areas. The most widely accepted explanation is that U-122 struck a mine. That fits the conditions of the patrol and the wider pattern of early war losses in those waters. But no final action was ever confirmed, and no certain ending could be attached to the boat. It was one of the early examples of a U-boat simply failing to return and leaving very little behind. U-209 disappeared in 1943 in Arctic waters, far from the main convoy lanes of the Central Atlantic. Conditions there were brutal. Weather, ice, poor visibility, and long distances made patrols dangerous even before enemy forces were encountered. Rescue in such waters was unlikely, and any attempt to reconstruct a final action was far more difficult than in the main Atlantic theatre. The most widely accepted explanation is that U-209 was sunk by Soviet anti-submarine forces during Arctic operations. That remains the strongest conclusion, but the final attack was never established beyond doubt. U-355 was lost in the same Northern War. It disappeared later in 1943 while operating in Arctic waters, where enemy patrols, bad weather, and the difficulties of tracking individual boats all added to the uncertainty. The most likely explanation is that U-355 was destroyed during anti-submarine operations in the far north. As with U-209, no final action could be tied to the loss with certainty. U-376 vanished in 1943 during the height of the Atlantic convoy struggle. By that stage of the war, U-boats were facing stronger escort groups, improved radar, better air coverage, and far more effective anti-submarine tactics than they had earlier in the conflict. The most widely accepted explanation is that U-376 was destroyed during Allied convoy defense operations. That would fit both the time and the place of its disappearance, but no single attack could be matched to the loss beyond doubt. U-647 remains one of the starkest mystery cases of the war. In July 1943, while moving through the North Atlantic north of the British Isles, it sent its last report. Then the signals stopped. No confirmed Allied attack matched its disappearance. In some of the other missing cases, a likely cause at least stands in the background. With U-647, even that remains uncertain. It is one of the clearest examples of a U-boat simply vanishing without a satisfactory explanation. U-703 was lost later, in 1944, when the war had already turned decisively against the U-boat arm. By then, Allied aircraft covered wider stretches of ocean, escort tactics were more refined, and patrol routes had become increasingly dangerous. The most likely explanation is that U-703 was destroyed by Allied anti-submarine action, but no conclusive report ever closed the case. U-855 belongs to that same late phase. By 1944 and 1945, many German patrols had become far more defensive in character. Boats spent more time trying to avoid detection than trying to strike convoys. The most widely accepted explanation for U-855 is that it too was lost to enemy action, but not in a way that could be tied to one certain attack. U-1226 was different from the others because it left behind one especially suggestive clue. Before disappearing in late 1944, it reported trouble with its schnorkel gear. By then, the schnorkel was essential to U-boat survival. It allowed diesel engines to run while the boat remained submerged at periscope depth, reducing exposure on the surface. But it was mechanically unreliable and dangerous in bad weather. The most widely accepted explanation is that technical failure played a central role in the loss of U-1226, possibly leading to flooding or an operational accident from which the crew could not recover. No confirmed wreck has settled the case. The final report remains the clearest indication of what may have happened, and these were only some of the better-known disappearances. Across the war, dozens of U-boats vanished in the same way. They left port, entered their patrol areas, sent their routine signals, and then disappeared from the record. Most were probably lost to mines, escorts, aircraft, or technical failure, but none received a confirmed ending. They were simply gone. Part of the answer was the ocean itself. The U-boat war was fought across immense distances, often in darkness, heavy weather, and poor visibility. A boat could be lost hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly force, and if it went down quickly enough, there would be no distress signal, no survivors, and nothing left on the surface to mark the spot. In Arctic waters, the problem was even worse. Ice, fog, storms, and short windows of visibility made it difficult not only to survive, but even to understand what had happened after the fact. Another reason was the nature of anti-submarine warfare. Escort groups rarely fought neat, easily documented actions. A destroyer might gain contact, lose it, regain it, and attack again over the course of hours. Aircraft could strike a target, see oil, bubbles, or wreckage, and report a probable sinking. In the moment, that might seem certain. Later, it often was not. When wartime attack reports were compared against German patrol records, some sinkings that once looked straightforward no longer matched the timing, the location, or the missing boat in question. A U-boat, thought destroyed on one date, might still have transmitted after the attack. Once that happened, the certainty disappeared. Minefields added another layer of confusion. A U-boat entering or leaving its patrol area could be lost instantly without ever seeing the weapon that destroyed it. There would be no pursuit, no visible duel, and often no enemy report that clearly marked the loss. The boat would simply vanish between one signal and the next. That was especially true in the North Sea, the waters around Britain, and other heavily defended approaches where mines were a constant danger throughout the war. Mechanical failure mattered too, especially later in the conflict. By 1944, German boats were increasingly dependent on equipment like the Schnorchel to reduce the time spent on the surface. Engine trouble, flooding, battery problems, torpedo malfunctions, or damage taken in bad weather could all become fatal, especially if the boat was already trying to avoid detection. In those cases, there might be no enemy attack to record at all. The patrol would simply stop. And as the war went on, the pace of events made clarity even harder. Patrol areas were crowded. Allied air coverage expanded. Escort groups became more aggressive. Boats were rerouted, redirected, and pushed into increasingly dangerous waters. Some disappeared in the middle of major convoy battles. Others vanished on approach routes before they ever reached their patrol lines. In the final years of the war, U-boats were being lost so frequently and in such difficult conditions that not every ending could be tied to a single clear event. That is why these cases remained unresolved. Not because nothing could be guessed, but because too many endings rested on probability rather than proof, regardless of how likely a cause might have been. For the German Navy, a missing U-boat meant the disappearance of an entire crew, and no clear explanation to send home. Families were usually told only that the boat had failed to return from patrol and was presumed lost. In many cases, that uncertainty never fully went away. Within the wider history of the Atlantic War, these boats remained a small part of the overall losses. Most U-boats that were destroyed can still be tied to a likely attacker or a known cause. But this smaller group stands apart because even in one of the most heavily documented naval campaigns of the war, some endings were still lost. Most of the U-boat war can be followed from departure to destruction. These boats cannot. Their stories end with a last signal, an overdue return, and then silence. and that silence remains one of the bleakest parts of the U-boat war. In the North Atlantic waters in late 1945, a formation of Allied ships and aircraft gathered for an unusual mission. Their targets were German U-boats, the same feared submarines that had stalked the Atlantic in World War II. But these U-boats were not fighting back. They lay dead in the water, crewless and surrendered. One by one, Allied gunners and bombers sent the masses of U-boats to the ocean floor in choreographed blasts and plumes of spray. It was a grim spectacle of victory. The once lethal U-boat fleet was finally wiped out by its former adversaries. This is the story of Operation Deadlight, the Allies' final mission to eradicate the U-boat menace and finally close the chapter on this once feared adversary. During World War II's Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats had been a scourge on Allied shipping, nearly strangling Britain's supply lines. By 1945, however, the U-boat arm was a defeated force. With Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, U-boat crews across the Atlantic and European waters surfaced and gave up their submarines. In total, 156 U-boats surrendered to the Allies in the first weeks of May 1945. Many of these were corralled by the Allies at designated ports. The primary holding areas became Loch Ryan in Scotland and Lisa Halley in Northern Ireland, where dozens of captured U-boats were moored in long, grey rows, awaiting a decision on their ultimate fate. Allied leaders were initially uncertain what to do with the huge inventory of U-boats. Options ranged from studying the advanced German submarine technology to dividing the U-boats among Allied navies, or simply destroying them to prevent any future threat. This question was settled at the highest level. At the Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945, the USA, UK, and USSR agreed that the larger part of the German submarine fleet shall be sunk, with no more than 30 U-boats to be preserved and split equally among the three powers for technical and experimental use. In other words, aside from a small handful kept for research, the U-boat fleet was slated for elimination. Implementing this decision fell to the newly formed Tripartite Naval Commission, which coordinated Allied naval dispositions. By late October 1945, plans for a scuttling operation were in place. At the Commission's 18th meeting of October 1945, it was confirmed that all remaining surrendered U-boats not allocated to an ally were to be destroyed in the open ocean by February 1946. Out of the 156 U-boats that had surrendered, around 30 were retained or claimed by Allied nations, 10 each by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, per the Potsdam quota, with a few extra boats handed to France and Norway or scrapped locally. The rest, ultimately 116 German submarines, were condemned to be scuttled at sea under Operation Deadlight. The Royal Navy was tasked with this operation, aiming to wipe out the remaining U-boat fleet in one concerted effort. Operation Deadlight was the codename given to the Royal Navy's plan to dispose of the surrendered U-boats from late 1945 into early 1946. The logistics were daunting. Over 100 submarines had to be stripped, towed out to sea, and sunk in deep water. Allied planners designated 3 deep water scuttling zones, about 100 miles northwest of Ireland, for the task. These remote Atlantic locations were deliberately chosen for their depth and isolation, to ensure the sunken U-boats would not pose a navigational hazard or be easily salvaged in the future. The plan for destruction was straightforward in concept. Each U-boat would be unarmed and prepared for scuttling. All weapons, munitions, and any critical documents or equipment would be removed. Tugs or naval vessels would tow the U-boats about 100 to 130 miles out to sea to the designated coordinates. Once at the scuttling ground, the preferred method was to sink the submarine by explosive charges set inside the hull on a timer. This would send the U-boat to the bottom in a controlled scuttling. Some U-boats, however, were earmarked for more dramatic ends. Allied aircraft were assigned to attack a number of the surrendered subs in order to give bomber crews live target practice. Additionally, a few U-boats would be torpedoed by Allied submarines as an exercise in anti-submarine warfare techniques. Naval gunfire from escorting ships was designated as the fallback method. If a charge failed to sink a U-boat, or if a submarine started foundering during tow, the nearest warship could finish it off with shells. British authorities moved quickly to execute the plan. Operation Deadlight orders were finalised on the 14th of November 1945, with scuttling operations scheduled to commence on the 25th of November 1945. The first batch of U-boats to be disposed of were those gathered at Loch Ryan in Scotland, which held the majority, 86 of the submarines earmarked for sinking. A smaller number were located at Lisahally in Northern Ireland and slated for later disposal. The Royal Navy assembled a force of tugs, warships, and support vessels, and coordinated with Royal Air Force Coastal Command, and even some Allied and former Allied-controlled ships, for example, the Free Polish Navy destroyer ORP Krakowiak, to carry out the task. Everything was ready, on paper. But now the Allies would have to contend with a familiar enemy in the North Atlantic, the winter weather. On the 25th of November 1945, the full-scale scuttling effort kicked off from Loch Ryan. Tow ropes were attached, and convoys of tugs slowly pulled strings of unmanned U-boats out into the Atlantic swell. Allied destroyers and frigates escorted the tows, ready to intervene if anything went awry. Whenever possible, demolition teams aboard the subs tried to set explosive scuttling charges and evacuate before detonation, as per the original plan. The preferred method was still to sink each U-boat with a controlled charge in its hull. However, the Atlantic had other ideas, and Operation Deadlight did not go entirely by the book. The winter weather in the North Atlantic proved to be a formidable adversary for the operation. Many of the U-boats had been sitting idle in exposed harbours for months and were in deteriorated condition. Once under tow in open water, the combination of heavy seas and the U-boat's poor state led to numerous problems. Tow cables often snapped in rough weather, and some U-boats began taking on water or capsizing en route. Allied crews struggled as gales whipped up fierce waves. About half of the U-boats never even made it to the planned scuttling zones. In fact, 56 U-boats sank prematurely while under tow, or had to be scuttled by their escorts before reaching the designated areas. In these cases, there was little ceremony. If a submarine started to founder, the nearest Allied ship would train its guns on it and send it under by force. What was intended as an orderly disposal at set coordinates often became a race against the elements to ensure the subs went down under control. Even for those U-boats that did reach the scuttling grounds, the original plan often changed. The rough seas made carefully timed explosive charges hazardous to set, and many explosives failed to detonate as expected. As a result, the majority of U-boats were ultimately dispatched by point-blank naval gunfire rather than by preset charges. Allied warships peppered the drifting U-boats with shells until they sank, a method that, while unsophisticated, proved effective under the circumstances. By the end of the operation, relatively few submarines had been sunk exactly according to plan. Flexibility and brute force became the order of the day. The outcome of Operation Deadlight can be tallied by the methods of destruction used on the 116 U-boats. Approximately 56 U-boats, nearly half, never reached the official zones. They foundered under tow, or were scuttled early by escort ships in bad weather. Only 2 U-boats were actually sunk using the intended demolition charges planted aboard. 7 U-boats were torpedoed by Allied submarines during the operation. 13 U-boats were destroyed by aerial attacks from Allied aircraft, Coastal Command bombers, or Fleet Air Arm planes. The remainder, roughly 38 U-boats, were dispatched by naval gunfire from surface warships once at the scuttling areas, or en route in some cases. Despite the challenges, the sheer scale of destruction was enormous. Day after day, Allied crews laboured in the cold and wind, sending one U-boat after another to a watery grave. Rusting German hulls that had once prowled the Atlantic now plunged into the depths amidst frothing water and oil slicks. The operation stretched over several months. After wrapping up the Loch Ryan contingent, attention shifted to the remaining subs at Lisahalli, which were towed out and disposed of in late December 1945 and early January 1946. The final 2 stragglers were sunk in early February. On the 12th of February 1946, the last U-boat of Operation Deadlight was sent to the bottom, marking the conclusion of the operation. By this date, every German U-boat that fell under the mandate of Operation Deadlight had been destroyed as planned. With 116 U-boats scuttled off the coasts of Northern Ireland and Scotland, Operation Deadlight achieved its primary goal. The Nazi U-boat fleet, which had threatened global shipping for years, was utterly erased, not by battle action, but by an administrative decision and Allied firepower after the war. The last U-boat sunk, U-3-514, was the final symbolic ending to the U-boat menace. This massive scuttling operation stands as one of the largest deliberate disposals of warships in history. In the immediate aftermath, there was little fanfare. The operation was initially conducted under a degree of secrecy, in part to prevent any last-minute incidents with German crews or to avoid public controversy. But news of hundreds of U-boats being blown up was hard to contain. The British Admiralty soon allowed journalists to witness some of the sinkings, resulting in newsreel footage and newspaper stories about the destruction of the U-boats. These reports framed Operation Deadlight as a dramatic final act of the naval war, with headlines highlighting the spectacle of surrendered Nazi subs being sent to the depths. Allowing press coverage also helped diffuse criticism from some quarters that questioned why the U-boats were being sunk instead of scrapped for useful metal. The Admiralty, when pressed, pointed out that this plan was agreed by Allied leaders and thus not open for debate, and moreover, Britain's shipbreakers already had over 1 million tons of Allied warship tonnage to scrap. The U-boats simply weren't needed for scrap. In short, politics and practical considerations aligned in favour of scuttling over salvage. To this day, no U-boat sunk in Operation Deadlight has been brought back to the surface. The submarines still rest where the Allies sent them over 3/4 of a century ago. Operation Deadlight remains a remarkable, if lesser known, episode of naval history. It was a postscript to World War II, a final demonstration of Allied resolve that the U-boat threat would never return. In a sense, it was the last battle of the Atlantic, fought not against a living enemy, but against the legacy of one. Though it lacked the overt heroics of wartime combat, Operation Deadlight was hugely significant in ensuring post-war security at sea. It eliminated any possibility that leftover German submarines could cause mischief or proliferate to other states. The operation's legacy now lies in the deep ocean off Ireland, a vast underwater graveyard of steel. There, the broken U-boat hulls serve as artificial reefs and historical time capsules, slowly corroding in silence.